Hello everyone, and welcome back to X-Ranger. Before we begin, I thought it would be interesting if each of you could leave a comment indicating which part of the world you're joining us from. Also, don't forget to like and subscribe if you're enjoying the episodes. Now let's get comfortable, relax, and start our program. I've held this inside for over 50 years now. I guess I should finally put it down somewhere. Maybe someone will believe me, maybe not. I don't really care anymore. What I saw that day in the summer of 1967 changed me forever, and I need to get it out. I was 12 years old, living in a small town near the Des Plaines River in Illinois. It was one of those brutally humid summer days where the air feels like a warm, wet blanket wrapped around you. My parents were fighting again, so I'd grabbed my bike early that morning and taken off, just wanting to be anywhere but home. Back then, kids could disappear for the day without anyone calling the police. Different times. I'd been riding for hours along the dirt paths that ran parallel to the river. The heat was getting to me, and I was feeling lightheaded, so I decided to take a break. I found this massive fallen oak tree near the riverbank that made a perfect natural bench. The tree must have come down during the spring floods, and it gave me a good view of the river. The Des Plaines isn't anything special, just a muddy, slow-moving river about 30 feet across at that point, with dense woods on both sides. I remember sitting there, my t-shirt soaked through with sweat, just watching the murky water flow by. There were these little swirls where fish would occasionally surface, and I was idly thinking about whether I should have brought my fishing pole when I noticed something moving on the opposite bank. At first, I thought it was just a shadow, or maybe a deer coming down to drink. But then, it fully emerged from the tree line, and I felt this cold sensation wash over me despite the heat. What stepped out wasn't a deer. It wasn't anything I recognized. This thing was massive. I'm not exaggerating when I say it had to be at least 7 feet tall, maybe taller, and it was covered in this thick, dark hair. Not fur exactly, more like human hair, but all over its body. Around its shoulders, the hair was matted and tangled with what looked like twigs and mud. I froze completely. I didn't even breathe. The creature hadn't noticed me yet. It stepped into the shallow part of the river, moving with this strange grace that didn't seem right for something so big. Its proportions were all wrong. Its arms hung down almost to its knees, and it moved in this fluid way that reminded me of how orangutans move, but more upright. It was doing something in the water. I think it was hunting for crayfish or clams. Its massive hands would dip beneath the surface, feeling around, then occasionally bring something up to its face. I couldn't see clearly across the distance, but the motions were deliberate, practiced. I sat there for what felt like forever, afraid to move a muscle. Then my throat betrayed me. I'd been holding my breath too long, and when I finally had to breathe, I let out this small, involuntary cough. The thing stopped moving instantly. It didn't turn right away. It just went completely still, like a statue. Then, very slowly, its head rotated toward me. I couldn't make out its face clearly from that distance, but I could feel it looking at me, studying me. For a long, terrible moment, we just stared at each other across the river. Then, without any warning, it sank down into the water until only its head was visible, and then it was gone, melting back into the shadows of the trees on the far bank. My brain started working again, and I thought, this is my chance. I need to get the hell out of here. But my legs felt like lead. I was trying to work up the courage to move when I heard a loud splash in the water right in front of me. A rock the size of a small loaf of bread had hit the water about 10 feet from the bank where I was sitting. Before I could process what was happening, another one splashed down, closer this time. Then a third, closer still. It was throwing rocks at me. It was trying to hit me. That snapped me out of my paralysis. I jumped up and grabbed my bike, which was leaning against the log. I was fumbling with it, trying to get my leg over the seat, when something made me look up toward the river again. My heart nearly stopped. The creature was standing in the middle of the river now, water swirling around its waist. It had crossed halfway already, moving silently through the water, and it was coming straight for me. It couldn't have been more than 20 feet away. From this distance I could see its face clearly, and that's the image that's haunted me all these years. Its face was dark, like it was smeared with mud, or naturally that color, with deep wrinkles creasing the forehead and around its wide, flat nose. Its eyes were what disturbed me the most. They were set wide apart, bulging slightly, and they had this intelligence in them. Not animal intelligence, something else, something that knew exactly what I was and wanted me to know it. The smell hit me then. This overpowering stench of wet dog mixed with stagnant water and something else I couldn't identify. Something rotten. I was frozen again, straddling my bike but unable to move, when the creature suddenly bent down, picked up another rock from the riverbed and hurled it directly at me. The rock whizzed past my head, missing by inches, and that finally shocked me into action. I pushed off hard, nearly falling as my bike wobbled, then caught my balance and started pedaling like my life depended on it, because I was absolutely certain that it did. The path along the riverbank was uneven, full of roots and rocks, but I didn't care. I just needed to get away. I'd gone maybe 50 yards when I heard it, this howl that didn't sound like any animal I'd ever heard. It wasn't like a wolf or a coyote. It was deeper, more resonant, almost like someone trying to imitate an animal, but not quite getting it right. The sound echoed across the water and through the trees. I made the mistake of looking over my shoulder as I rode. The creature had come fully out of the water now and was standing on my side of the river. It wasn't running after me, just standing there, watching. But that wasn't what made my blood turn to ice. Across the river, in the tree line where the first creature had emerged, I could see movement. Multiple tall figures moving among the trees, partially obscured by the foliage, but unmistakably similar to the thing that had just thrown rocks at me. There were more of them, many more. I don't remember much of the ride back to town. I just remember pedaling until my legs burned and my lungs felt like they would burst. I remember the taste of fear in my mouth, metallic and sharp. I remember looking over my shoulder constantly, terrified of seeing those creatures loping after me through the woods. When I finally reached the edge of town, I pulled over behind the old gas station and threw up. My whole body was shaking so badly I couldn't even hold onto my handlebars. I sat there on the ground for a long time, trying to make sense of what I'd seen. I never told anyone, not my parents, not my friends, nobody. Who would believe me? They'd say I was making it up for attention, or that I'd seen a bear or some homeless person, but I know what I saw. That was no bear, and it definitely wasn't human. At least, not entirely. The thing that has bothered me most all these years isn't just what I saw, but what I felt when it looked at me. There was recognition there, not like it recognized me personally, but like it recognized what I was, like it had encountered humans before and knew exactly what to do with them. I avoided the river after that. In fact, I never went back to that part of the woods again, not even with friends. A few weeks later, I overheard some adults in town talking about missing hunting dogs near the Des Plaines River, and how something had been breaking into fishing cabins out there, taking food and small items. I wanted to say something then, but the words wouldn't come. Throughout that summer, there were more stories. Hikers hearing strange noises, fishermen finding their boats moved or damaged overnight, a kid claiming he saw a monster while camping with his family. Everyone had rational explanations, bears, vandals, overactive imaginations, but I knew better. By fall, the stories had died down. Whatever those things were, they either moved on or became more careful. But every once in a while over the years, I'd hear about similar sightings in other parts of Illinois or neighboring states. Each time, my stomach would knot up. and I'd remember the creature's eyes staring at me across the river. I'm an old man now, and I've never gone hiking or camping since that day. I can't even bring myself to fish anymore. Something fundamental changed in me that summer day in 1967. I realized that we don't know everything about the world we live in. There are things out there in the dark spaces between towns, in the shadows of forests and the depths of rivers. Things that watch us and know us, but that we don't understand at all. Sometimes, even now, I wake up in the middle of the night, my heart racing, convinced I can smell that distinctive odor of wet dog and stagnant water in my bedroom. And in my dreams, I still hear that howl echoing across the Des Plaines River, calling to others of its kind, letting them know it's found something interesting. Story 2. I don't talk about this much. Actually, I haven't told anyone outside my family in years because people either think I'm making it up or they get that look, you know the one, where they're trying to decide if I'm crazy or just attention-seeking. But what happened to me when I was 15 still gives me nightmares, and I need to get this off my chest. I grew up in rural Kentucky, where our nearest neighbor was about half a mile away. We had this pit bull mix named Rex, who was the bravest dog I'd ever known. That dog would chase off coyotes twice his size and once even stood his ground against a black bear that wandered onto our property. Rex wasn't afraid of anything, which is why what happened that evening scared me so badly. It was late October, and I was taking Rex on our usual 5-kilometer loop around the back roads. We normally did this walk earlier, but I'd had a ton of homework, so we didn't head out until almost sunset. Mum had warned me not to go, but I figured with Rex by my side, I'd be fine. Plus, I knew these roads like the back of my hand. About halfway through our loop, we reached this stretch that cuts alongside this nasty swamp. I never liked that part of the walk. It always smelled like rotting vegetation and stagnant water, and the trees grew so thick you couldn't see more than a few feet into them. But it was the quickest way home, and Rex never seemed bothered by it. That evening, though, everything felt different. The air was unusually still, no birds, no insects, nothing. Just dead silence except for our footsteps on the gravel. I remember feeling the hairs on my neck stand up, but I tried to shake it off. Then Rex just stopped. He planted his feet right at the edge of the swampy section and refused to move forward. I tugged on his leash. "Come on, boy." But he tucked his tail between his legs, something I'd never seen him do, and started making this low, whining sound deep in his throat. When I tried pulling him again, he actually pulled back, trying to drag me in the opposite direction. That's when I heard it, a splash from somewhere in the swamp. Not a little splash like a frog jumping in, but something big. I froze and peered into the tree line, and my blood went cold. There, maybe 20 yards in, was something. I couldn't make out details in the fading light, but it was dark, massive, and standing upright, and it was watching us. I know it sounds stupid, but in that moment, I just knew it wasn't human. It was too big, too still. The way it stood there, partially hidden behind a tree but clearly focused on us. It felt predatory, like a hunter sizing up prey. I didn't wait to see what it would do. I yanked Rex's leash and started running back the way we came. For the first time ever, Rex didn't need convincing to run. He bolted ahead of me, practically dragging me along. The terrifying part? I could hear it moving in the woods parallel to us, not crashing through the underbrush like you'd expect from something that size, but moving with this disturbing silence, just keeping pace. Every few seconds I'd glance over and catch glimpses of it slipping between trees, always maintaining the same distance. After sprinting about half a kilometer, my lungs were burning. I'm not athletic, and the panic made it hard to breathe. Rex was still pulling me forward, but I was slowing down. That's when I heard the rumble of an engine up ahead and nearly collapsed with relief. It was Kevin, my friend Matt's older brother, driving his dad's tractor home from the fields. I frantically waved him down, probably looking like a complete lunatic. Kevin stopped, clearly confused at seeing me red-faced and gasping. "Dude, what's wrong?" he asked, cutting the engine. I couldn't even form complete sentences. I just kept pointing at the woods and stammering. Something's following us. In the trees. Please." Kevin looked where I was pointing, but obviously didn't see anything. He probably thought I was playing some stupid prank, but he must have seen something in my face that convinced him I was genuinely terrified. "Hop on," he said, restarting the tractor. I lifted Rex up first, which was no easy task since he's about 60 pounds, and then scrambled up behind him. As Kevin started driving again, I kept my eyes fixed on the tree line. The thing was still there, keeping pace with the tractor now. Even though we were going maybe 15 miles per hour, it had no trouble matching our speed, always staying just inside the tree line where it was hard to see clearly. We followed the road for another mile or so until the forest finally gave way to open fields. Only then did I lose sight of whatever was following us. I started to relax a little, thinking maybe it wouldn't leave the cover of the trees. When we reached the turn that would lead to my house, Kevin stopped to let me and Rex off. There was another vehicle pulled over, some lost driver asking for directions. Kevin was talking to them, and I decided I'd just cut across the open field to my house. It was only about a quarter mile away, and I could see the porch light on. With no trees around, I figured we were safe. Rex seemed calmer too, trotting alongside me as we crossed the field. We were maybe halfway across when Rex suddenly stopped again. His hackles rose, and he started growling, not his usual aggressive bark, but this deep, terrified growl that made my skin crawl. I turned around and my heart nearly stopped. The thing was there, at the edge of the field where the forest began again, but it wasn't hiding anymore. It was running, actually running on two legs, straight toward us. The distance it covered in seconds was impossible. No human could move that fast. In the dying light, I got my first clear look at it. It was tall, way taller than any man I've ever seen, maybe 7 feet or more. It was covered in dark hair or fur, with long arms that swung at its sides as it ran. Its face, I still can't describe its face clearly. All I remember are eyes that seemed to reflect light like an animal's, and a shape that was almost human but wrong somehow. I don't remember making the decision to run. 1 second I was frozen in terror, and the next I was sprinting for my life toward our house, Rex right beside me. I've never run so fast in my life. My lungs burned, my legs felt like they would collapse any second, but pure adrenaline kept me going. The entire time I could hear it behind us, heavy footfalls getting closer and closer. I didn't dare look back again. I just focused on our front door, screaming for my parents even though I knew they probably couldn't hear me. We reached our yard, crossed it in seconds, and I practically threw myself against the front door, fumbling with the handle. Rex was barking frantically now, spinning in circles and snapping at the air behind us. I managed to get the door open, yanked Rex inside, and slammed it shut. I locked it, then collapsed on the floor, shaking uncontrollably. My mom came running from the kitchen, asking what was wrong. I couldn't even speak. I just pointed toward the front door, still trying to catch my breath. My dad grabbed his shotgun and went to look outside, but by then, whatever it was had disappeared. They thought I'd just spooked myself in the dark, even though they couldn't explain why Rex, our fearless dog, was trembling and refusing to leave my side for the rest of the night. I slept with my bedroom light on for weeks afterward. Looking back, I realized this wasn't my first encounter with whatever it was. When I was 9, my cousins and I found these huge footprints by my neighbor's pond. There were 2 sets, one massive, easily twice the size of my dad's feet, and another slightly smaller. We made plaster casts of them, but my uncle later said they were probably just bear tracks, even though they clearly looked like feet. Then, in July 2021, I had another experience. I was driving home around 2 in the morning after dropping off a friend. About a mile from my house, I spotted what I thought was a man standing in someone's front yard. It was dark, but my headlights caught what looked like khaki shorts. As I got closer, though, I realized all I could actually see were these enormous yellow eyes reflecting in my headlights. Whatever it was stood behind a tree stump. One I know is about 3 feet tall, and it towered over it. I hit the brakes and sat there for a few seconds, trying to process what I was seeing. Then I made a U-turn to get another look, but it was gone, completely vanished. There was nowhere it could have hidden that quickly unless it had darted into the woods across the road. I know how this sounds. Trust me, I've gone over it 1,000 times in my head, trying to find some rational explanation. Was it a bear standing on its hind legs? No, bears don't chase you through the woods for miles. A homeless person? In our rural area, miles from any town? Some kind of prank? No one around here would know how to move that fast or silently. The area where I live has had a few reported Bigfoot sightings over the years. I used to laugh at those stories. I don't laugh anymore. I still live in the same area, but I never walk that loop road again, especially not near dusk. Rex passed away last year at the age of 12, and I miss having him around, especially on nights when I hear something moving outside my window. Some nights I wake up convinced there's something watching me from the tree line behind our property. I don't know what chased me that day. I don't want to know, but I'll never forget the sound of it running behind me, getting closer with each step, or the feeling that if I'd been just a little slower, it would have caught me, and I wouldn't be here to tell this story. Story 3. I still struggle to talk about what I saw that morning. It's been nearly 3 years, but I can recall every detail like it happened yesterday. I've been hunting the bottomlands along the Illinois River my whole life. 42 years of experience in those woods. I know every sound, every animal, every trail, but what I encountered that November morning doesn't fit into anything I've ever known. I had set up my tree stand about 20 feet up in a mature oak 2 days before the hunt. Perfect spot with good visibility of a clearing and several game trails. It was November 12th, peak of the rutting season, and I was hoping to bag a nice buck. The temperature was in the low 40s that morning, just cold enough to see your breath. I remember being grateful for my thinsulate gloves as I climbed up to my stand at around 5:30 in the morning, well before first light. The sunrise that day was spectacular, deep oranges and reds breaking through the tree line to the east. By 6:30, I could see well enough to make out details in the clearing. I'd been sitting motionless for about half an hour, just listening to the woods wake up. Squirrels were already active, and I heard a barred owl call from somewhere behind me. Nothing unusual so far. Around 7, maybe 7:15, I heard rustling in a dense thicket about 40 yards to my southwest. The sound was heavier than a deer would make, but in rutting season, bucks can get pretty careless. They crash through brush, drag their antlers on trees, and generally make a racket when they're looking for does. So I got ready, thinking I might get a shot at a nice 10-pointer. I remember adjusting my position slightly, lifting my Remington 30-06 to rest it across my knees, not shouldering it yet, but getting prepared. The rustling continued, steady and deliberate, not the stop-and-start movement typical of deer. Whatever was moving through that thicket was big and wasn't concerned about making noise. Then it emerged partly from the edge of the thicket, and I felt my heart skip several beats. My first thought was, that's not a deer. My second thought was, what the hell is that? Because what I was looking at didn't make any sense. Standing there, partially obscured by the outer branches of the thicket, was what I can only describe as a creature that resembled a gorilla, but much taller and leaner than any gorilla I've ever seen at a zoo or on TV. It was bipedal, standing fully upright on 2 legs, and it had to be at least 7 feet tall, maybe even closer to 7.5. The thing had broad shoulders, a powerful chest, and long, muscular arms. Its body was covered in dark brown fur or hair that looked almost black where the shadows hit it. The fur wasn't shaggy like a bear's. It was shorter and seemed to lie flat against its body. Where the early morning sunlight filtered through the trees and hit its back and shoulders, the fur had a slight reddish tint. I remember my fingers going numb on my rifle, not from the cold, but from shock. I didn't raise the gun. I didn't even think about shooting. I was completely frozen, just trying to process what I was seeing. The creature was moving deliberately along the edge of the thicket, not rushing, but covering ground with long, smooth strides. It never fully stepped into the clearing, staying partially concealed by the vegetation, but I had a clear enough view to see its profile and movement. Its head was set directly on its shoulders, with what seemed like almost no neck. The head was shaped somewhat like a cone, rounded at the top and then tapering down. I couldn't make out facial features clearly from my angle and distance, but the face seemed flatter than a gorilla's, less protruding. What struck me most was how it moved. It wasn't lumbering or awkward like you might expect from something that big. It moved with purpose, almost gracefully, each step deliberate and silent despite its size. Its arms swung naturally at its sides as it walked, occasionally reaching out to push aside branches. I watched it for maybe 20 seconds as it traversed the edge of the thicket, moving in a northerly direction toward the river. It never made a sound. No grunts, no vocalizations of any kind, just that initial rustling as it moved through the denser part of the thicket. The entire time, I was trying to rationalize what I was seeing. Was it a bear walking on its hind legs? No, the proportions were all wrong, and the movement was too fluid, too natural for a bear trying to walk bipedally. Was it someone in a costume? Out here, 5 miles from the nearest road, in hunting season, when wearing something like that would be practically suicidal, and the movement was too natural. No human could fake that fluid motion in rough terrain. The creature seemed completely unaware of my presence. I was downwind from it, about 20 feet up, and hadn't moved a muscle since it appeared. My tree stand was well camouflaged with local materials, and I was wearing full camo, including a face mask. I don't think it ever knew I was there. As it reached the northern edge of the thicket, it turned slightly toward the river and disappeared into the brush. I sat there for what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes, my rifle still across my knees, my heart pounding so hard I could feel it in my temples. I'm certain the creature had emerged from a stand of extremely dense pines about 200 yards behind the thicket. It's an area I've tried to hunt before, but it's nearly impenetrable. Thick undergrowth, fallen trees and pines so tightly grown together you can barely squeeze between them. Perfect cover for something that doesn't want to be seen. After it disappeared, I debated what to do. Should I get down and try to find tracks? Should I follow it? The thought of getting closer to whatever that thing was sent cold chills down my spine. I decided to stay put. I told myself I was still hunting, but the truth is, I was too shaken to move. I stayed in that stand until noon, never seeing another living thing bigger than a squirrel. No deer came through the area at all, which is unusual for that spot during rut. It was like everything was avoiding that section of the woods. When I finally climbed down, my legs were stiff from sitting motionless for so long. I walked over to where the creature had been, looking for tracks or hair, anything that would confirm what I'd seen. The ground there is mostly covered with leaf litter and pine needles, which don't show tracks well. I found some broken branches and what might have been depressions in the ground, but nothing conclusive enough to photograph or show someone else. I've replayed that morning in my head countless times since then. I've hunted my whole life, taken deer, turkey, even the occasional black bear when I hunted up in Michigan. I know what's supposed to be in those woods. I can identify any animal native to Illinois by sight, sound, or track. What I saw that morning doesn't fit anything I know. My son hunts the same area occasionally. About a month before my encounter, he mentioned hearing strange sounds early in the morning and at dusk. Sounds he described as whoops and what he thought might be wood knocks. He's 24, been hunting since he was 12, and not the type to make things up. At the time, I brushed it off, thinking maybe it was other hunters or unusual bird calls carrying through the bottomlands. Now, I'm not so sure. I didn't tell anyone about what I saw for almost 6 months. My wife noticed something was off when I came home that day. I was quiet, distracted. I told her I hadn't seen any deer and left it at that. I was afraid of sounding crazy. Eventually, I told my son, then my brother, who hunts with me sometimes. They believed me, which was a relief. My brother reminded me of stories his grandfather used to tell about wild men in the river bottoms back in the 30s and 40s. I've been back to that same stand a dozen times since then. Part of me hopes to see the creature again, to confirm I wasn't imagining things. Another part of me dreads the possibility. I've installed a trail camera nearby, but it's never captured anything unusual. Just deer, raccoons, coyotes, the usual suspects. I still hunt those bottomlands regularly. It's in my blood, but I don't hunt alone anymore, and I'm always aware of my surroundings in a way I wasn't before. My 30-06 stays within reach, though I'm not sure I'd shoot even if I saw that creature again. Something that elusive, that unknown, should probably stay that way. I've researched similar sightings since then. There are reports of similar creatures throughout the Midwest, particularly in river bottoms and remote wooded areas. Some people call them Bigfoot or Sasquatch. I don't know what to call what I saw. I just know it was real. It was there, and it doesn't fit into any category of wildlife I've studied or encountered in my 4 decades of hunting. What bothers me most isn't the fear, though I was terrified in the moment. It's the uncertainty. If something like that can exist in woods I've known my entire life without being documented or understood, what else might be out there that we don't know about? The bottomlands don't feel quite as familiar to me anymore. There's a mystery there now, moving silently between the trees, leaving no evidence but the memory of its passing and the absolute certainty that for 20 seconds on a November morning, I saw something impossible. Story 4. I've never really told anyone about this except my husband. I guess I've been too afraid people would think I'm nuts or making it up for attention. But I need to get this off my chest, and maybe someone here has seen something similar. The first time it happened was 20 years ago, when I was camping with my family and a few others at Cherry Plains State Park in New York. We were a group of 4 families, all with young kids, and we'd set up our tents in a circle around a common area where we had our campfire. It was one of those perfect summer camping trips, swimming during the day, hot dogs and s'mores at night. The kids running around collecting sticks and playing games. That particular night, we adults were sitting around the fire after all the kids had gone to bed. It must have been around 11 or so, and we were just talking quietly, having a few beers, enjoying the night. I remember it was unusually quiet. Normally the woods are full of sounds at night, but there was almost nothing. At the time, I didn't think much of it. I got up to check on my kids because my youngest was only 4 and sometimes had nightmares when we camped. Our tent was on the far side of the circle, maybe 30 feet from the fire. The path between the tents was dark. We had those little solar lights marking the main walkways, but they didn't do much. I had a small flashlight, one of those cheap dollar store ones that barely lights up a few feet in front of you. I was passing the miller's tent when I felt it, that weird feeling you get when someone is staring at you. I turned to my right, toward the trees behind their tent, and there it was. I still get goosebumps thinking about it. This being was standing there just at the edge of the trees, maybe 10 feet away from me. We were the same height, I'm 5'7", and it was just watching me. It wasn't huge like you'd expect from Bigfoot stories. It was covered in this grayish-brown hair that looked straight and coarse, almost like horsehair, but rougher. The weirdest part was its face. It wasn't ape-like at all. It had a flatter face, more human-like, but not quite human either. No pronounced jaw or muzzle like you see in drawings of Bigfoot. Its eyes caught the tiny bit of light from my flashlight. They were dark but reflective, like a deer's eyes at night, but not as bright. I completely froze. I couldn't move, couldn't scream, couldn't do anything but stand there staring at it. And it stared right back at me. It seemed just as surprised to see me as I was to see it. We just stood there, facing each other in complete silence. I don't know how long, probably only seconds, but it felt like forever. My heart was pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. I remember thinking about my kids in the tent, wondering if I should run to them. But I was too scared to move. I finally managed to take one step backward toward the campfire. It didn't move. I took another step back, then another, not taking my eyes off it. When I was about halfway back to the fire, I finally turned and hurried the rest of the way. My hands were shaking so bad, I dropped my flashlight. I reached the fire and spun around to look, and it was gone. Just gone. There was no sound of it running away, no branches breaking, nothing. I sat down hard in my chair, and my husband asked if I was okay. I looked like I'd seen a ghost, he said. I almost told everyone right then, but I just couldn't. What would I say? That I saw some hairy, human-like thing in the woods. They'd think I was drunk or playing a joke. So I made up something about nearly stepping on what I thought was a snake, but turned out to be a stick. The rest of the night, I kept looking toward the trees, but didn't see anything. I barely slept, jumping at every sound. The next morning, I walked over to where it had been standing and looked for tracks or hair or anything, but the ground was covered in pine needles and hard dirt. There was nothing. For years, I convinced myself it was just a weird shadow or my imagination. We kept camping, kept hiking. I kept living my life, but I never forgot it, and I always felt uneasy in the woods after dark. Then it happened again, at my house. This was just last summer during that brutal heat wave. Our house is pretty rural, with woods behind us and fields on either side. Our nearest neighbor is about half a mile down the road. Because of the heat, I was doing laundry late at night when it was cooler. It was almost midnight, and I was in our basement putting clothes in the dryer. Our basement is partially above ground, with small windows near the ceiling that are about 6 feet off the ground outside. I was bending down, loading the dryer, when something caught my eye. I glanced up at the window and saw it walking past. I only saw its head, shoulders, and upper back as it passed by the window, but it was the same. That same grayish-brown, straight, coarse hair, based on the window height, whatever it was, had to be at least 7 feet tall. It was moving at a steady pace, not running, just walking purposefully past our house. I stood completely still, half crouched by the dryer, one of my husband's t-shirts clutched in my hands. I remember thinking, this isn't happening, not again. But it was real. As it passed by, it bumped against the side of the house, not hard, just a slight bump like when someone brushes against a wall. There was a soft thud, and the window frame rattled slightly. Then it was gone, just like that. I ran upstairs so fast I tripped on the top step and bruised my knee. My husband was asleep, and I shook him awake, finally telling him everything about the camping trip 20 years ago and what I'd just seen. To his credit, he didn't laugh or dismiss me. He grabbed his flashlight and went outside to look around, but found nothing. The next morning, we checked outside the basement window. The ground was dry and hard from the heat wave, so there were no footprints, but there was a weird smudge on the window, like something had brushed against it. And one of our tomato plants that had been growing against the house was broken. Since then, I've been terrified to go outside after dark. I've installed motion sensor lights all around our property. I keep the blinds closed at night. I'm always listening for sounds outside. I've spent hours researching online, trying to find similar stories. The height doesn't match typical Bigfoot descriptions. The first one was my height, the second much taller. The face wasn't what people usually describe. The hair wasn't curly or matted, but straight and coarse. What's most unsettling is that 20 years passed between encounters. Whatever these things are, they've never tried to hurt me, but they terrify me all the same. I can't explain them. I know what I saw both times, but I have no idea what they were. Sometimes I wonder if they're curious about us, the way we're curious about wildlife. Maybe that first one was young. That would explain why it was smaller and why it seemed so startled to see me. Maybe the one at my house was an adult. I know how this sounds. I know most people would say I imagined it, or that I saw a bear standing up or some guy in a costume. But I know what I saw. Its eyes were intelligent. It moved with purpose. Both times, I got the distinct feeling that it was just as surprised to see me as I was to see it. I haven't seen anything since that night last summer, but I can't shake the feeling that they're still out there, in the woods around our house. Sometimes when I'm alone and it's quiet, I swear I can hear something moving around outside. The dogs bark at nothing. Things go missing from our yard, small things like garden tools or toys the kids have left out. My husband wants me to set up trail cameras, but part of me doesn't want proof. What would I do if I actually caught one on camera? Who would I tell? Would it make these beings angry? All I know is that somewhere in the forests around my home, something unexplainable exists. And for whatever reason, our paths have crossed twice now. I just hope it doesn't happen a third time. Story 5. I've been carrying this story with me for almost 50 years now. I've only told it to a handful of people, and most of them just sort of nod and smile like they're humoring me. But what happened to me and my friend John back in September of '72 was real, and I still get goosebumps thinking about it. I was 10 years old at the time. My dad took me and my friend John on a weekend fishing trip to Sequoia National Park near Bishop, California. John's aunt and uncle came along too. I was so excited about this trip. Dad had been promising to take me camping in real wilderness for ages, and finally, I was old enough. We spent most of that weekend fishing and exploring. The weather was perfect. Not too hot during the day, but chilly enough at night that the campfire felt amazing. Dad taught us how to bait our hooks and clean the fish we caught. We ate trout for dinner both nights, cooked right over the fire. Everything smelled like pine needles and smoke. It was exactly the kind of adventure a 10-year-old dreams about. Sunday afternoon came way too fast, and it was time to pack up. Dad and John's uncle were taking down the tents while his aunt was organizing all the cooking stuff. John and I were bored, so Dad told us we could walk a little way up the trail ahead of them as long as we stayed on the path and didn't go too far. "Just stay where I can see you if I look up," he said, stuffing our sleeping bags into their covers. So John and I took off, racing each other up the trail. It wasn't a difficult hike, just a dirt path winding through the trees, gradually going uphill. We were pretending to be explorers, stopping to examine interesting rocks or weird-shaped sticks. The sun was still pretty high in the sky, maybe around 4 in the afternoon, and everything was bathed in that golden light that happens in the mountains. We'd gone maybe a quarter mile ahead of the adults when the trail curved around a bend and opened into this small clearing. I remember it perfectly. There was a fallen log on one side that had these huge shelf mushrooms growing on it. The path continued on the other side of the clearing, heading upward and eventually curving around the side of the mountain. I stopped to catch my breath, and that's when I looked up at the mountainside to our right. It was steep, really steep. Not like a sheer cliff, but the kind of slope where if you tried to climb it, you'd have to use your hands and feet both, and you'd probably slide down a lot. It was covered with loose shale and scree, those little broken bits of rock that shift under your feet. There were a few scraggly trees growing at weird angles out of the rock face, but mostly it was just this imposing wall of stone and loose rock, and that's when I saw it. At first, my brain couldn't make sense of what I was seeing. About halfway up the mountainside, maybe 100 yards away from us, something huge and black was moving. Not climbing, like a person would have to do on that terrain, but running. Actually running down the steep face of the mountain. I froze, completely froze. My mouth went dry instantly. This thing was massive, way bigger than a person. It was solid black, covered in what looked like fur or hair, and it was moving with this bizarre agility that seemed completely impossible given the terrain. It was taking these huge, bounding strides down a slope that would have sent a human tumbling to their death. The rocks weren't even sliding under its weight, which made no sense. I remember thinking very clearly, nothing can move like that. Not a person, not a bear, not anything I'd ever seen or heard of. The way it balanced and the speed it was moving, it was just wrong. Physics-defying wrong. I couldn't speak for what felt like forever. Finally, I managed to croak out, "John." John was a few steps ahead of me and turned around with this annoyed look, probably thinking I was trying to scare him with some dumb joke. But then he saw my face, followed my gaze, and saw it too. "What is that?" he whispered, his voice tight with fear. The creature was still coming down the mountain, moving diagonally across the face, getting closer to the trail, maybe 100 yards ahead of where we stood. It was so fluid, so fast. I'd watched mountain goats before, and even they moved cautiously on steep terrain. This thing was just gliding down, like the laws of gravity didn't quite apply to it. Then suddenly it stopped, just stopped dead still on the mountainside. And I swear to this day, it turned its head and looked directly at us. I couldn't make out facial features from that distance, but I could feel it staring. My whole body went cold, like I'd been dunked in. Ice water. Every instinct I had was screaming danger. I grabbed John's arm. "Run," I said, just that one word. We turned and sprinted back down the trail, moving faster than I'd ever run in my life. I remember my legs feeling wobbly with fear, like they might give out. We were both breathing in these short, panicky gasps. I kept expecting to feel something grab me from behind. The worst part was not looking back, not knowing if it was following us. We tore around the bend in the trail and nearly crashed into my dad, who was coming up to look for us. "Whoa, slow down," he laughed, catching me by the shoulders. Then he saw our faces. "What's wrong? What happened?" We were both talking at once, words tumbling out. "There's something on the mountain, a big black thing. It was running down the cliff. It saw us." Dad's expression changed from amusement to concern. He looked over our heads up the trail, then back at us. "What do you mean? A bear?" "No," John said. "It was like a big gorilla or something." My dad frowned. "There aren't any gorillas out here, boys." "Dad, I'm not making it up." I was almost crying with frustration and lingering fear. It was huge and black, and it was running down that steep part of the mountain like it was nothing. He must have seen how genuinely terrified we were, because he didn't dismiss us outright. Okay, let's go back to camp. You can tell me and John's aunt and uncle exactly what you saw." We hurried back to the campsite, where Dad made us sit down and tell the whole story again. John's aunt gave us both cups of hot chocolate, which helped calm us down a bit, but I still felt jittery and exposed, like the thing might appear at any moment. "Could it have been a bear?" John's uncle asked. "Black bears can move pretty quick when they want to." I shook my head vehemently. It wasn't a bear, it was standing upright, and bears can't run down a mountainside like that. "Maybe it was someone in a costume," John's aunt suggested. "Some hiker playing a prank." "No way," John said. "It was way too big, and nobody could move like that on those rocks. They'd fall and die." That was the part that scared me the most. The impossibility of what we'd seen. The way it moved with such confidence and speed over terrain that should have been treacherous. No human could have navigated that slope the way this thing did. And if it had wanted to catch us, it could have. Easily. The thought made my stomach clench. The adults exchanged glances over our heads. I could tell they didn't fully believe us, but they weren't dismissing it entirely either. "Well," my dad finally said, "we're all packed up and ready to go anyway. Let's head back to the car." No one suggested going back up the trail where we'd seen the creature. Instead, there was a service road about half a mile in the other direction that would take us to where we'd parked. Without discussion, That's the way we went, the adults positioning themselves around John and me like a protective barrier. The whole drive home, I kept seeing it in my mind, that massive black shape defying gravity as it ran down the mountainside. I kept thinking about how it had stopped and looked at us. Had it been curious, territorial, hunting? The questions circled in my head. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every sound outside my window made me tense up. My mom, who hadn't come on the trip, tried to reassure me it was probably just a bear that looked strange from a distance. But I knew better. We both did. John and I talked about it at school the next day, and for many days after that. We drew pictures of what we'd seen and compared them. Our drawings were similar, a large, hair-covered humanoid shape. Neither of us had seen it clearly enough to draw detailed features, but we both emphasized its size and the impossible way it moved. The weird thing is, as weeks passed, the adults in our lives seemed determined to minimize what had happened. Boys and their imaginations, they'd say with a smile when the subject came up. Eventually, John started to go along with this narrative. Maybe it was just a bear, he'd say with a shrug when I brought it up. But I could see in his eyes that he didn't believe that. I never wavered, though. I know what I saw. Years later, when I was in college, I came across an article about Bigfoot sightings in California. There was a section specifically about the Sierra Nevada region, with reports dating back decades. People described a large, black ape-like creature that moved with incredible speed through difficult terrain. Reading those accounts, I felt that same ice-cold sensation I'd experienced in the clearing. I'm 60 years old now. I've hiked in many wilderness areas since then, always with a mixture of hope and dread that I might see something like that again. I never have, but I've never forgotten the absolute certainty I felt in that moment, that what we were seeing wasn't human, wasn't a known animal, and wasn't something I could explain. Sometimes I wonder if it's still out there, running across impossible slopes in Sequoia National Park. And sometimes on dark nights when I can't sleep, I wonder if it remembers the two small boys who froze in fear at the sight of it before turning and running away. I don't have answers. I just have this memory, burned into my mind with perfect clarity. A massive black creature, defying gravity and logic, staring directly at me from the side of a mountain. And the absolute knowledge that if it had wanted to catch us that day, it could have. Story 6. I still get cold sweats thinking about what happened that night at Mason Lake. It's been 46 years, and I've never shared this story outside our small group. My therapist thinks talking about it might help with the nightmares that still wake me up sometimes. So here goes. It was August 12th, 1977. I was 16, and my brother Glenn was 15. We'd organized a fishing trip with 4 of our buddies from school, Mike, David, Tim, and Joey. Mason Lake in Lampasas County was our regular spot. We'd been there dozens of times before, usually camping overnight to catch catfish when they were most active. We arrived around 5:30 in the afternoon in Mike's dad's station wagon, packed with our gear, tackle boxes, coolers with sodas and sandwiches, sleeping bags, and my dad's old aluminum rowboat strapped to the roof. It was hot as hell, typical Texas summer, and we were all sweating through our t-shirts before we even got our lines set up. The lake was pretty quiet that day. There were a couple of other fishing parties when we arrived, but they packed up before sunset. We had our usual spot, a little inlet with a gradual slope to the water and some big oak trees for shade. The fishing had been decent that summer, and we were hoping to catch enough for a fish fry the next day. We set up our lines along about 50 yards of shoreline, using chicken livers and worms for bait. Glenn and I had this system where we'd row out and drop some lines in deeper water, then check them every hour or so. The other guys stayed on shore, bullshitting around a small fire and taking turns checking their own lines. Everything was normal at first. We caught a few small ones, threw them back. Joey's transistor radio was playing some Eagles song, and we were just shooting the breeze about school starting back up in a couple weeks. Tim had brought some beer he'd stolen from his dad, but I only had one because I wanted to stay alert for the night fishing. The sun went down around 8, and the temperature dropped just enough to be comfortable. The moon was almost full that night, which was good because it meant we could see without using too many flashlights that might scare the fish. The lake surface was like glass, reflecting the moonlight. At around 9:30, Glenn and I decided to do one last check of our deep water lines before settling in for some serious night fishing. We hauled the rowboat down to the water's edge, over this patch of gravel that made this distinctive crunching sound. I remember that sound vividly because of what happened next. We were just about to push off when we heard it. This weird crackling noise coming from the darkness beyond our campsite. At first, I thought maybe it was one of the guys messing with us, crushing twigs or something, but it was different, deeper, heavier. "You hear that?" Glenn whispered. I nodded, straining to see into the darkness. The moon was bright, but the tree line cast heavy shadows. The crackling got louder, and then there was something else, a sound I still can't properly describe. It was like a rush of air, but heavy, purposeful, like something big moving fast. And then we saw the trees. Jesus Christ, I'll never forget this. The trees at the edge of our clearing started moving, not swaying in the wind, falling, like something was knocking them down as it came toward us. My whole body went cold. I couldn't move. I couldn't even breathe. Glenn grabbed my arm so hard it left bruises. That's when we saw it. In the gap between the trees, illuminated by moonlight, was something I still struggle to explain. It was huge, 7 or 8 feet tall at least, covered in dark hair or fur that looked matted and thick. The proportions were all wrong for a human. Its arms were too long, swinging slightly as it stood there, and its head seemed too small for its body. There was barely any neck visible. But the eyes... God, the eyes were what haunted my nightmares for years. They glowed orange in the darkness, reflecting the moonlight or our campfire in a way no animal's eyes should. For what felt like forever, we just stood there, locked in place. I couldn't even scream. My brain was trying to make sense of what I was seeing, trying to fit it into some category of animal I knew. Bear? No? Person in a costume? Absolutely not. This thing moved with purpose, with weight. It was real and massive and watching us. I stumbled backward and hit the boat. The aluminum made a hollow sound that snapped me out of my trance. Glenn was still clutching the back of the boat, his knuckles white. Without a word, we both started pushing the boat into the water. I don't think I've ever moved so fast in my life. We weren't thinking, just reacting. I fell into the boat more than climbed in, banging my shin hard on the seat. Glenn practically dove in after me. We both grabbed the oars and started rowing like our lives depended on it, because we were absolutely certain they did. We were screaming. Glenn later said we sounded like 8-year-old girls, and he wasn't wrong. I was making noises I didn't know I could make. Stuff was flying out of the boat, tackle boxes, bait containers, a flashlight splashing into the water. We didn't care. We just needed distance between us and that thing. I kept looking back, terrified I'd see it swimming after us or running along the shoreline. The moonlight on the water made every ripple look like a monster's head to me. My heart was pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. We rowed parallel to the shore, back toward where our friends were. When we got close enough, the guys were all standing at the water's edge, looking confused and worried. They'd heard our screams. We beached the boat so hard we nearly flipped it. I fell out into the shallow water, soaking myself, but I didn't care. I just scrambled up onto the shore. "We gotta go! We gotta go now!" I was yelling. Glenn couldn't even form words, just pointing back in the direction we'd come from. Joey started laughing, thinking we were pulling some kind of prank. But Mike took one look at our faces and knew. Later, he told me he'd never seen anyone look that scared before. "What happened?" David asked. already starting to pack up his gear. I tried to explain, but the words wouldn't come out right. Something in the trees. Big eyes. Glenn finally found his voice. There's something out there. It knocked down trees. It's not human. We need to leave right now. Tim thought we were overreacting to a bear sighting, but when I grabbed him by the shoulders and told him no bear has orange eyes or stands upright at 8 feet tall, he shut up and started helping pack. We left almost everything. Sleeping bags, most of the fishing gear, the cooler, even Joey's radio. We just grabbed our wallets and keys and ran for the car. Mike couldn't get the key in the ignition because his hands were shaking so bad, I had to do it for him. As we peeled out of there, tires spinning on the dirt road, I looked back through the rear window. I swear to God, I saw something move at the edge of our campsite, something big melting back into the trees. We drove straight to the sheriff's office in town. The deputy on duty clearly thought we were just drunk teenagers, but he wrote down our story anyway. He promised to send someone out in the morning, but I could tell he wasn't taking it seriously. We all crashed at Mike's house that night. None of us slept. We just sat in his living room with all the lights on, jumping at every sound outside. The next morning, Mike's dad drove us back with the deputy to get our stuff. In the daylight, everything looked normal. There were no fallen trees, no giant footprints, nothing. The deputy gave us this look like, "See, I told you so," and helped us load our abandoned gear. But I know what I saw. Glenn knows too. We found some broken branches high up on trees, too high for a person to reach, but the deputy said it was probably storm damage. The other guys, they believe something scared us, but I don't think they ever fully believed what we described seeing. Over time, they chalked it up to shadows and moonlight playing tricks on us. Glenn and I never went back to Mason Lake after dark. Not once in all these years. We still fish, but always in open areas, always with a clear view of our surroundings, and always home before sunset. I've read about Bigfoot sightings over the years, watched documentaries about cryptids and unknown creatures. Some descriptions come close to what we saw, but nothing matches exactly. I don't know what was in those woods that night. I don't want to know. All I know is that when I close my eyes sometimes, I still see those orange eyes staring at me from the darkness. I still hear the sound of trees falling as something impossibly large moved through the forest. And I still wake up in a cold sweat, grateful to be in my bed and not back at Mason Lake on that August night in 1977. Story 7. I've never really shared this with anyone outside of a police report and a few close friends who probably thought I was nuts. But after seeing other accounts online of people experiencing similar things, I figured maybe someone here might have answers. This happened back in the summer of '74, and I still get chills thinking about it. I was 23 back then, living about 10 miles outside Des Moines, Illinois. Had a decent job at the machine shop and spent most of my free time working on my Harley Sportster. That bike was my pride and joy. Candy apple red with chrome pipes that I'd polished until you could see your face in them. I'd saved for 2 years to buy it and another 6 months customizing it exactly how I wanted. That night in July, I'd been over at my buddy Mike's place. We'd been working on his car until maybe 11:30 or so. It was hot as hell that summer, but the nights would cool down just enough to make a motorcycle ride perfect. The moon was nearly full, so visibility was decent despite being late. I remember thinking how peaceful it was, barely any traffic, just me and the rumble of my bike. The route home took me across this old bridge that spanned a ravine with dense woods on both sides. It wasn't anything special, just a 2-lane concrete bridge about 70 yards long with metal railings. I'd crossed it hundreds of times, never gave it a second thought. I was about halfway across when I felt something change. It's hard to explain, but the air just felt different, heavier somehow. At first I thought it might rain, but the sky was clear. I slowed down a bit, and that's when I caught movement out of the corner of my eye. To my right, at the end of the bridge, was something dark, something big, really big. My first thought was that it was a bear, even though we didn't have bears around Des Moines. But this thing was massive, taller and bulkier than any bear I'd ever seen pictures of, and it moved all wrong. It was just standing there for a split second at the edge of the tree line where the ravine started to slope down. Then it just dropped. It went down this steep embankment, must have been about 50 feet, but it didn't tumble or crash. It was controlled, deliberate, like it just decided gravity was optional. I hit my brakes and skidded to a stop, nearly laying down my bike. I couldn't believe what I was seeing. This thing crossed the road at the bottom of the ravine and then started climbing up the opposite side toward the bridge. It scaled what would take a person 20 minutes to carefully climb in about 5 seconds. 5 huge strides, if you could call them strides. More like leaps, but weirdly silent. The sound of my bike's engine echoing off the ravine walls was the only noise. This thing, whatever it was, moved without making a sound. No breaking branches, no heavy footfalls, nothing. I don't know what possessed me. Probably the dumbest instinct I've ever had. But I kicked down my stand, got off my bike, and started following it. I had this overwhelming urge to see what it was. I jogged to the edge of the bridge where I'd seen it climb up and peered into the woods. The moonlight filtered through the trees, creating these weird patches of silver blue light and pitch black shadow. And that's when I saw it moving through the trees about 40 yards away. It weaved between trunks that were barely 10 feet apart, but it never slowed down or seemed to have trouble fitting through spaces that should have been too narrow for something its size. I know this sounds crazy, but the phrase that popped into my head was cat-elephant. It had the grace and fluidity of a cat, but the raw power and mass of something much larger. It was probably 7 or 8 feet tall, but hunched over as it moved. Its proportions were just wrong. Arms too long, legs bent at angles that didn't make anatomical sense. I followed it for maybe 40 yards into the woods, stepping as quietly as I could. The ground was soft from rain earlier that week, so my boots didn't make much noise on the forest floor. I kept my eyes locked on its silhouette as it moved deeper into the trees. Then it stopped, just froze completely. And even though I couldn't see a face or eyes, I absolutely knew, it had sensed me. Everything in my body suddenly screamed danger. It was like this primal switch flipped in my brain, and I realized I wasn't the hunter here. I was prey. My curiosity evaporated instantly, replaced by the most intense fear I've ever felt. It was visceral, like ice water injected straight into my veins. I felt my skin go clammy and cold despite the summer heat. My heart hammered so hard I could feel it in my throat. I backed up slowly at first, trying not to make sudden movements, but then the thing shifted slightly, just the smallest adjustment in its posture, and I broke. I turned and ran faster than I've ever run in my life. I didn't look back. I didn't need to. I could feel it watching me. I burst out of the tree line, sprinted across the bridge to my bike, and fumbled with the keys. My hands were shaking so bad I could barely get the key in the ignition. The entire time I felt exposed, like at any second something was going to grab me from behind. When the engine roared to life, I gunned it. I took that road going 90 and didn't slow down until I reached my driveway. I nearly crashed twice, taking corners too fast, but I couldn't make myself slow down. The need to get away was overwhelming. When I got home, I locked every door and window in my house. I sat in my living room with all the lights on and my dad's old hunting rifle across my lap until sunrise. I didn't sleep a wink. The next day, I called in sick to work and went to the police station. The officer who took my statement was this older guy named Wilson. He wrote everything down, but I could tell he didn't believe me. He mentioned that a bunch of teenagers had reported seeing something in the woods that summer, but they'd all been at the drive-in the weekend before watching that movie, The Legend of Boggy Creek. He basically implied I'd either been drinking or had seen the same movie and let my imagination run wild. But I hadn't seen any monster movies, and I'd only had one beer at Mike's hours before. I know what I saw. For weeks afterward, I took the long way home, adding almost 30 minutes to my commute just to avoid that bridge. I bought a handgun and got my concealed carry permit. I'd never been interested in guns before, but after that night, I never went anywhere near the woods without it. The nightmares started about a week later, always the same one. I'm chasing the creature through the woods, just like I did that night. But then suddenly, it stops and turns around, and then I'm the one being chased. I'd wake up drenched in sweat, heart pounding, convinced there was something in my room watching me. I tried to research what it might have been. This was before the internet, so I spent hours at the library looking through books on local wildlife, folklore, even Native American legends. Nothing matched what I'd seen. The closest thing was stories about Sasquatch, but this wasn't that. It didn't move like a big ape or a person. It moved like something else, something that shouldn't exist. About a month after it happened, I was at a bar in town and overheard a couple of guys talking about seeing something strange on County Road 16, which runs parallel to the road with my bridge, but about 3 miles north. They described seeing something dark and massive crossing the road late at night. They were laughing about it like it was just a weird story to tell, but I felt sick to my stomach. I wanted to go talk to them, compare what we'd seen, but I couldn't bring myself to do it. I didn't want to remember that night any more than I already did. By October, I couldn't take it anymore. The feeling of being watched whenever I was outside after dark, the nightmares, the constant anxiety. It was ruining my life. I quit my job and moved to my cousin's place in Nebraska. I told everyone it was for better work opportunities, but the truth was, I couldn't stand being in Des Moines anymore. I sold my Harley too. Couldn't enjoy riding it anymore. Too exposed, too vulnerable. Every time I got on it, I remembered the sound of my engine echoing off those ravine walls and that feeling of being hunted. It's been almost 50 years now, and I've never gone back. Never told my wife or kids the real reason we don't visit that part of Illinois. Sometimes I wonder if I imagined it all, if Officer Wilson was right, and I'd just let some movie I don't even remember seeing get to me. But then I remember how it moved. That impossible fluid grace combined with raw power. How it dropped down that steep embankment and climbed back up like it was nothing. The absolute certainty I felt in that moment that if I didn't run, I wouldn't live through the night. I don't know what I saw on that bridge in '74, but whatever it wasn't something that's supposed to exist in our world. And sometimes, late at night, when I can't sleep, I still wonder if it's out there, moving through the trees like a cat elephant, waiting for the next curious fool to follow it into the woods. Story 8. I've been sitting on this experience for almost a month now, and I still can't wrap my head around what happened. I don't know if sharing it here will help me make sense of it, but I need to tell someone who won't immediately dismiss me as crazy. It was Saturday, July 15th. I remember the date clearly because I'd spent most of the day helping my dad with his boat. We were planning to take it out the next weekend, and there was a lot of maintenance to catch up on. By the time we finished, it was close to midnight. Dad had already gone inside, but I wanted to put away the last of the tools properly in the garage rather than leaving them out. After organizing everything, I hit the garage door button and stepped outside to have a quick smoke before heading in. That's when it hit me. This smell. God, it's hard to describe if you've never experienced it. Like a wet dog, but so much worse. Musky, wild, almost bearish, but with this strange underlying sweetness that made my stomach turn. It was thick in the air, like you could almost taste it. I actually gagged a little and called out to my dad, who was still awake in the kitchen. "You smell that? It's like something died or a bear rolled in sewage." He came to the door, took a sniff, and shrugged. He could smell something but didn't think it was that bad. "Probably just a skunk or something," he said before going back inside. But it wasn't a skunk. I've smelled plenty of those living out here in rural Pennsylvania. This was different, more primal somehow. As I stood there trying to place it, I noticed something else. All the neighborhood dogs were going crazy. We have about 5 or 6 houses within earshot, all with dogs, and they were all barking in this frantic, synchronized way I'd never heard before. Not their normal territorial barking when someone walks by, but something more urgent, alarmed. I looked around but couldn't see anything in the darkness beyond my property. Our yard backs up against about 30 acres of dense woodland that eventually connects to state forest land. I've always loved living on the edge of the woods, but that night, the tree line looked especially dark and forbidding. After finishing my cigarette, I went inside, locked up, and tried to forget about it. I slept poorly that night, kept waking up thinking I heard something moving outside my window. By morning, I'd mostly convinced myself it was nothing. Sunday morning, July 16th, I got up around 9 and made coffee. Looking out the kitchen window that faces our backyard, something immediately seemed off about the landscape. At first, I couldn't place what was bothering me. Everything looked normal enough. The lawn needed mowing, Dad's garden was doing well, the tree line was... Wait. There's this old oak tree about 20 yards from our back porch. It's massive, probably over 100 years old. One of its major limbs, a branch almost as thick as my thigh, was now hanging dramatically lower than it had been the day before. I'm talking about a 15-foot-long branch that had previously been about 12 feet off the ground, now drooping down to maybe 6 feet up. That's weird, I thought, figuring maybe it had been damaged in a storm. But there hadn't been any storms. The weather had been dry and calm for days. No wind, no rain, nothing that could explain a partially broken tree limb. I mentioned it to my dad over breakfast. "Did you notice that branch on the oak is broken?" He hadn't, but didn't seem concerned. "Probably rot," he suggested. "That tree's old." But I know that tree. I grew up climbing it. That particular branch was healthy. I'd been up on it just a few weeks ago to hang a bird feeder. There was no way it had suddenly rotted overnight. After breakfast, I went out to inspect it closer. The branch wasn't actually touching the ground, just hanging at this unnatural angle, still partially attached to the trunk. What struck me as I got closer was how it was broken. This wasn't a clean snap like you'd see from wind damage. The break wasn't even in one place. The wood appeared to be twisted, like someone had grabbed the end of the branch and forcefully rotated it until the fibers started to give way. I took some pictures with my phone and tried to make sense of what I was seeing. The break had this spiral pattern to it, almost like when you twist a green stick until it comes apart in strands. But this wasn't a green stick. This was a solid hardwood branch about 8 inches in diameter at its base. The whole day, I kept going back to look at it, trying to come up with a logical explanation. By evening, my curiosity had gotten the better of me. I decided to remove the damaged section entirely to examine it more closely. I got my chainsaw, cut through the remaining attached fibers, and carefully lowered the branch to the ground. Up close, the damage was even more bizarre. The wood fibers hadn't simply snapped. They'd unwound from each other like rope strands. I called my dad over to look. "Ever seen anything like this?" I asked. He frowned, turning the severed end over in his hands. "Not from weather," he admitted. "This looks like something physically twisted it." "Like what? A tornado?" I suggested, knowing full well we hadn't had one. "No," he said slowly. "More like something grabbed it and twisted." He looked uncomfortable saying it. My dad's not one for wild theories. "Like a person," I pressed. He shook his head. "Would take one hell of a strong person, or several. And why would anyone do that?" That's when I remembered the smell from the night before, and the dogs barking. A chill ran down my spine as I connected the dots. "Could it have been a bear?" I asked, already knowing bears don't twist tree branches like this. Dad just gave me a look. "Bears break branches when they climb trees for food. They don't twist them off for fun. We stood there in silence for a moment, both of us unwilling to voice what we were thinking. Finally, I said it. I'm going to check for footprints. The ground was pretty dry and hard, mostly covered with grass and fallen oak leaves near the tree. I wasn't expecting to find much, but I had to look. I searched in expanding circles around the tree, looking for any sign of disturbance. Nothing obvious jumped out at me, no massive footprints like you see in those Bigfoot shows. But I did notice an area where the leaf litter seemed compressed, like something heavy had stood there. When I pointed it out to my dad, he just shrugged. Could be anything. Deer bed down under that tree sometimes. But deer don't twist oak branches until they break. As the sun started to set, I felt increasingly uneasy. I kept looking toward the woods, feeling like I was being watched. The dogs in the neighborhood were quiet now, almost too quiet. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about what could have done that to the tree. Whatever it was, had to be incredibly strong. I thought about the smell, that musky animal odor that was too strong to be a normal woodland creature. I thought about the dogs all barking at once, like they sensed a predator. And I thought about the twisted wood fibers, so unusual that even my practical, no-nonsense father couldn't explain them. Around 3 in the morning, I heard something outside. A soft, rhythmic sound that might have been footsteps, but too widely spaced to be human, too heavy. I froze in my bed, not daring to get up and look out the window. The steps seemed to circle the house once, pausing occasionally, before moving off toward the woods. In the morning, I half expected to find more damage or evidence, but there was nothing new. Just that broken branch lying where we'd left it. Its twisted fibers a reminder that something unexplainable had happened. I decided to preserve the broken section of branch. I clear-coated it to keep the wood from deteriorating and kept it in my garage. Sometimes I take it out and examine it, trying to convince myself there's some logical explanation, but I know what I think happened. I think something came out of those woods that Saturday night. Something big enough and strong enough to twist an oak branch until it gave way. Something that made the dogs go crazy and left that unforgettable smell in the air. Since then, I've started researching. Turns out, broken and twisted branches are often reported in areas with Bigfoot sightings. They call them tree breaks or tree twists, supposedly territorial markers or signs of their presence. The smell I experienced matches countless descriptions of Bigfoot encounters. That unmistakable musky odor that lingers in the air. I know how this sounds. Believe me, I do. If someone told me this story a month ago, I'd think they were full of it. But I can't explain what happened any other way. Something visited my property that night. Something strong enough to twist solid oak. Something that terrified every dog in the neighborhood. Something that left behind an odor I'll never forget. I haven't told anyone outside my family about this. My dad still insists there must be a logical explanation, though he can't provide one. My mum thinks maybe some local kids were messing around, though how teenagers could twist an oak branch like rope is beyond me. As for me, I've been keeping a closer eye on the woods behind our house. I've installed motion-activated lights and a trail camera facing the tree line. So far, nothing unusual has shown up on camera, but I can't shake the feeling that whatever visited us that night is still out there, watching and waiting. I still hear the neighborhood dogs go crazy sometimes, always late at night. And twice now, I've caught that. Same musky odor on the breeze. I don't go out at night anymore if I can help it. Some things, once you've seen the evidence, you can't unsee. The broken branch sits in my garage. Its twisted fibers a reminder that there are things in this world we can't explain. Things that can snap solid oak like it's nothing. Things that move through the night, leaving nothing but broken trees and lingering smells as evidence they were ever there. Story 9. I've debated for months whether to post this. It's still hard to talk about, even though it's been years now. I never believed in this stuff before it happened to me. I was the skeptical one who'd laugh when my friends would talk about ghost stories or weird creatures in the woods. Now I don't laugh anymore. This all started back in 2009. I was living in a small house near Sharon in Noble County, Ohio. It was nothing fancy, just a simple place with some land around it. I'd moved there because I wanted some peace and quiet after my divorce. The house backed up against some woods with a small creek running through the property. There was an old bridge about 50 yards from my back door that crossed over to a hiking trail. The first time something happened, I was washing dishes one evening around 9 o'clock. It was early fall, already dark outside. 3 loud knocks came from the back of the house, not like someone politely knocking on a door, but like someone taking a baseball bat and wham, wham, wham against the siding. It was so forceful the windows rattled. I nearly dropped the plate I was washing. My first thought was teenagers playing pranks, so I flipped on the back porch light and looked out. Nothing. I even worked up the courage to go outside with a flashlight, but I couldn't see anyone. The woods were dead quiet. No crickets, no frogs, nothing. That silence felt wrong somehow. I remember standing there with goosebumps despite the warm evening. I chalked it up to maybe a branch falling or some animal, but deep down I knew better. Branches don't knock 3 times in perfect sequence. A few months passed without incident. I almost forgot about it until one night in February of 2010. I was reading in bed when the knocking started again. 3 distinct bangs against the back wall of the house. This time I was too scared to go outside. Instead, I peered through the blinds, and that's when the smell hit me. I had cracked the window earlier because the house was stuffy, and suddenly this overwhelming stench poured in. It was like rotten eggs mixed with decaying meat and something else I can't even describe. The smell was so strong I gagged and had to cover my mouth with my shirt. I slammed the window shut, but the smell had already gotten into the room. I ended up sleeping on the couch that night because my bedroom reeked. The next morning, I checked around the house again. No footprints, no signs that anything or anyone had been there. I told myself maybe a skunk had sprayed nearby, but I knew that wasn't it. This smell was different. It was like death, but worse. After that night, things went quiet for a long time. Almost 3 years passed without incident. I started to think maybe I'd imagined it all or exaggerated it in my mind. I even started to feel safe again. Then came the summer of 2013. I was tending to my vegetable garden when I found it, a pile of feces unlike anything I'd ever seen. It was enormous, black, and had bits of berries and what looked like fur in it. No dog or bear could have left something that size. It was at least 3 times bigger than anything my neighbor's St. Bernard ever left behind. I took photos of it on my phone because I wanted proof, but I deleted them later because they grossed me out so much. That discovery put me on edge again. I started keeping the windows closed at night despite the summer heat. I bought motion detector lights for the backyard. I even considered getting a gun, which wasn't like me at all. About 2 weeks after finding the feces, it happened. The thing that still makes my skin crawl when I think about it. It was a Thursday evening in July, around 8:30. The sun was just starting to set, but there was still plenty of light outside. I was sitting in my recliner watching TV with a clear view through my French doors that faced the backyard. I wasn't even paying much attention to what was outside when movement caught my eye. At first, I thought it was a person walking through my yard. My brain tried to make sense of it. Maybe a hiker had gotten lost from the trail. But as I focused on it, I realized this was no person. It was tall, much taller than any man I've ever seen. 7 feet at minimum, maybe even 8. Its body was covered in dark hair or fur that looked black in the dimming light. The hair hung long on its arms, which swung as it walked. Its gait was smooth but strange, kind of rolling from side to side, yet purposeful. The thing never looked toward my house. It just walked calmly across my yard. about 40 to 50 feet away from where I sat frozen in my chair. It moved toward the bridge, and I could see its massive shoulders and the back of its head, which seemed to sit directly on those shoulders without much of a neck. I couldn't move. I couldn't scream. I just sat there clutching the arms of my recliner so hard my knuckles turned white. My heart was hammering so loud I was sure the thing would hear it, but it never turned around. The whole sighting probably lasted less than 30 seconds, but it felt like hours. Once it disappeared into the trees beyond the bridge, I shot up and locked every door and window in the house. I pulled all the blinds down and sat in the middle of my living room floor with all the lights on, shaking uncontrollably. I didn't sleep that night, or much for the next week. What I saw matched exactly what people describe as Bigfoot. It looked just like that famous film from the 60s, the Patterson-Gimlin footage. I'd always thought that film was a hoax, but now I know better. What I saw was real. It was a living, breathing creature walking through my yard as casually as you'd stroll through a park. I called a friend the next day, but I could tell she didn't believe me. She suggested I was stressed, or that maybe I'd seen a bear walking on its hind legs. But I know what bears look like. This wasn't a bear. It wasn't a person in a suit. It was something else entirely. The knocking never returned after that sighting, but I started noticing other things. Areas of flattened grass in the morning, as if something heavy had been lying there. Strange, twisted branches in the woods that didn't look natural. More of those foul-smelling areas near the tree line. I lasted another 3 months in that house before I put it up for sale. I couldn't live there anymore. Every night was torture, wondering if that thing was watching me through the windows. I'd lie awake listening for sounds outside, jumping at every creak or groan the house made. The realtor asked why I was selling such a charming property, and I made up something about wanting to be closer to family. I couldn't tell her the truth. After I moved, I started researching Bigfoot sightings in Ohio. There have been dozens reported in Noble County alone. I found another account from someone who lived just a few miles from my old house who claimed to have seen at least 2 different creatures on their property, once back in 1984 and again in 2004. Their description matched what I saw. I've tried to rationalize what happened. Maybe it was just a bear. Maybe the knocking was some natural phenomenon. Maybe the smell was from a dead animal in the woods. But deep down, I know what I saw. I know what was visiting my property. I still have nightmares about it. In them, I'm sitting in that recliner, again, watching through the French doors. But in the dreams, the creature turns and looks directly at me. Its eyes are intelligent, knowing. And instead of walking toward the bridge, it starts walking toward my house, toward the doors that suddenly seem far too fragile. I wake up from those dreams gasping for air, my sheets soaked with sweat. I don't know why it never approached the house that evening. I don't know if it knew I was watching. All I know is that I'll never go back to Noble County, and I'll never again dismiss someone's story about seeing something impossible. Because sometimes the impossible is real, and it might just walk through your backyard one summer evening when you least expect it. Story 10. I've debated for months whether to share this. Some of you will think I'm crazy or lying, but I swear on everything I hold dear that what I'm about to tell you happened exactly as I describe it. My son and I experienced something on the Buffalo River last September that I still can't fully process. My boy Jake and I try to do at least one father-son camping trip every year. He's 17 now, getting ready for college next fall, so these trips mean more than ever. We're both pretty experienced outdoorsmen. I was a scout leader for years, and Jake's been fishing since he could hold a rod. We decided on a 3-day kayaking and fishing trip on the lower Buffalo River in Arkansas. Neither of us had been on that particular stretch before, but we'd heard great things about the smallmouth bass fishing there. The first day went perfectly. Beautiful weather, caught some decent fish, and found a nice spot to camp. Nothing unusual at all. We were in high spirits, heading into the second day. Around 4 in the afternoon on day 2, we were paddling through a narrow section where the river cuts between 2 rocky bluffs. I was leading in my kayak, Jake about 20 feet behind me. That's when it happened, the first thing anyway. I heard a commotion on the riverbank to my right. At first I thought it was a deer crashing through the underbrush, but this was different, heavier, more deliberate. Whatever it was moved through the forest like a bulldozer, snapping branches and shaking small trees. Then came this sound. I struggle to describe it even now. Like an enraged monkey, but deeper, more guttural. Not a bear, not a cougar. Nothing I've ever heard in my 20-plus years of hunting and fishing. I stopped paddling and looked back at Jake. His face told me he heard it too. "What the hell was that, Dad?" he called out. I just shook my head and motioned for us to keep moving. My first instinct was to put distance between us and whatever made that sound. About 2 miles downstream, we found a spot to make camp, a narrow gravel bar jutting out into the river. In hindsight, it wasn't ideal. The bar was maybe 30 feet wide, with the river on one side and dense woods rising up a slope on the other. But daylight was fading, and the next suitable camping spot was supposedly several miles further. We beached the kayaks and started setting up. That's when we heard it, a distinct knocking sound, like someone hitting a tree with a stick or rock. It came from across the river, up on the ridge. 2 knocks, then 3 more after a pause. Jake looked at me and joked, "Hey Dad, isn't that how Bigfoot communicates?" We laughed it off. I'm a practical guy. I've always dismissed Bigfoot stories as campfire tales. I told Jake it was probably a woodpecker or a branch falling. We got our tent up and started preparing dinner on our small camp stove. I had brought along a weather radio, so I turned it on to check the forecast. As the staticky voice announced clear skies for the night, we heard a yell from the ridge near where we'd heard the knocks. Not a human yell, something between a howl and a scream. It raised the hair on my arms. "Dad!" Jake's voice had lost all its earlier humor. "Probably just an animal," I said, trying to sound more confident than I felt. "Let's finish setting up." Over the next hour, as darkness fell, things escalated. We heard rocks being thrown, not falling, but thrown from the bluff into the river. Splash, splash, splash. Then more tree knocks, this time from different directions, like they were answering each other. The monkey-like sounds returned, but now it seemed like there were multiple sources. Jake and I tried to rationalize it. Maybe local kids were messing with us, but we hadn't seen a single other person on the river all day. Could it be a family of bears? But bears don't throw rocks or knock on trees in patterns. Each explanation fell apart as soon as we considered it. Around 8 o'clock, we heard something new, a deep, chattering vocalization that seemed to come from just inside the tree line behind our camp. It lasted maybe 10 seconds, and it was unlike anything I've ever heard. Jake grabbed my arm, his fingers digging in. "We need to leave," he whispered. I checked my watch and shook my head. "It's already dark. We can't navigate the river at night. Too dangerous." I didn't say what we were both thinking, that whatever was out there might be more dangerous. We built up our campfire as large as we safely could and set up our flashlights to create a perimeter of light around our camp. I had my hunting knife, and Jake had a hatchet we'd used to gather firewood. Not much protection, but it was all we had. By 10 o'clock, the activity had increased. We could hear movement in the forest behind us, branches breaking, leaves rustling, not the normal sounds of forest creatures. These were heavy, deliberate movements. I kept thinking of that bulldozer-like crash through the woods we'd heard earlier. Were they, whatever they were, surrounding our camp? Jake and I sat back to back, watching the darkness beyond our circle of light. Neither of us spoke much. What was there to say? We both knew this wasn't normal. At one point, I heard Jake quietly crying, trying to hide it from me. My son, who I'd never seen cry since he was 13, was terrified, and so was I. Around 11:30, we heard a loud snap. a log breaking just inside the tree line, maybe 15 feet from our tent. It wasn't a subtle sound. It was a deliberate break, like something wanted us to know it was there. That's when we decided on rotating fire watch. We couldn't both sleep, not with whatever was out there. We agreed on 2-hour shifts. Jake would sleep first while I kept watch. Then we'd switch at 1:30. My shift was tense but relatively uneventful. The noises continued, more rock throwing, more knocks, but nothing came closer than the tree line. The strangest thing was a kind of singing that started around 12:30. Not words, just tones, rising and falling in a pattern that seemed almost conversational, like they were communicating through these eerie melodies. It came from multiple directions, as if they were calling to each other across the darkness. I woke Jake at 1:30, and he took over watch while I tried to sleep. I don't think I actually slept at all, just lay there with my eyes closed, every sense straining for any change in the sounds outside. At around 3:30, I gave up pretending to sleep. Jake was sitting by the fire, his face pale in the flickering light. "They're still out there," he whispered as I sat up. "I can feel them watching us." As if to confirm his words, another log snapped, this one even closer than before, maybe 10 feet from our tent. That was it for me. I stood up. "Start packing," I told Jake quietly. "We're getting out of here at first light." We began breaking down our camp as quietly as we could, taking down the tent, packing our gear, preparing the kayaks for a quick launch. It was strange. As soon as we started clearly preparing to leave, the harassment stopped. The forest went silent, except for normal nighttime sounds. It was almost as if they understood our intentions and were satisfied. We huddled by the fire for the remaining hours until dawn, jumping at every little sound. As the first grey light appeared in the sky, we doused the fire and finished loading the kayaks. Just as we were about to push off, one final rock splashed into the river directly across from our campsite. A farewell message, maybe, or a warning. We paddled harder than I've ever paddled in my life. Neither of us spoke for the first hour. When we finally stopped to rest our arms, Jake looked at me with haunted eyes. "What was that, Dad? What happened back there?" I shook my head. "I don't know, son. I really don't know." After we got home, I couldn't stop thinking about it. I finally reached out to a ranger friend of mine who put me in touch with a Buffalo River ranger. I was hesitant at first, afraid of sounding crazy, but the ranger's response shocked me. He wasn't surprised. He told me there had been similar incidents in that area. He didn't elaborate, and I didn't press for details. What would be the point? I'm sharing this now because I'm worried about other families. What if someone else camps in that spot with young children? What if whatever was out there decides to do more than throw rocks and break branches? The helplessness I felt that night, trapped on that narrow gravel bar with nowhere to run if they decided to come for us, still gives me nightmares. I've tried researching Sasquatch encounters in Arkansas since then. Some of the accounts describe exactly what we experienced: the tree knocks, the rock throwing, the vocalizations, but I still can't bring myself to say definitively that's what we encountered. All I know is that something intelligent was out there, something that wanted to frighten us, something that knew exactly how vulnerable we were. Jake and I haven't been camping since. He says he's not ready yet. Maybe next summer. I don't blame him. Some nights, I still wake up hearing those sounds. That deep chattering vocalization, the angry monkey screams, the eerie singing in the darkness. And I wonder if they're still there, waiting for the next unsuspecting campers to make the same mistake we did. I don't have answers. I just have this experience that I can't explain. And a warning: if you're kayaking the lower Buffalo and you hear tree knocks, paddle faster. Don't stop. Don't make camp. Just keep going. Story 11. I still don't know what to make of what happened on my property. It's been over 20 years now, but I remember it like it was yesterday. Some nights I still wake up in a cold sweat, thinking about what might have been watching me from the trees all those months. My wife and I had just bought our dream home outside Marion, Indiana in late 2000. Nothing fancy, just a modest 3-bedroom on about 5 acres, backing up to a pretty dense patch of woods. We were so excited to finally have some space after living in apartments for years. The previous owners were an elderly couple who'd moved to Florida, and they'd left the place in decent shape, though the yard needed work. It started in January 2001, about 3 weeks after we'd moved in. It was a bitter cold morning, temperature probably in the teens. I remember because the night before we'd had this argument about the thermostat setting. I like it cooler at night, but my wife was freezing. Anyway, I was up early as usual, around 6:30, making coffee in the kitchen. Our kitchen had this big bay window that looked out toward the back of the property and the tree line beyond. My wife came down around 7:15, still wrapped in her robe and looking tired. I poured her a cup, and we just sat there quietly, watching the sun come up. There was frost on everything, and the whole yard had this pristine, untouched look to it. The coffee was still too hot to drink, so I was just holding the mug for warmth and staring out the window. That's when I saw it. At first, I thought maybe it was a neighbor walking along the edge of our property, though that wouldn't have made any sense given how early it was and how cold. But as I focused on the movement, I realized whatever it was stood way too tall to be an average person. I'm 6 foot, and this thing had to be at least 7 feet tall, maybe more. It was moving slowly along the tree line, about 60 or 70 yards from the house, just walking, kind of casual-like, but with this weird, hunched posture. The thing that really froze me was the color. It was pitch black, not like someone wearing dark clothes. It was covered head to toe in this thick, matted black hair or fur, like nothing I'd ever seen before. "Do you see that?" I whispered to my wife, not taking my eyes off it. "See what?" she asked, still half asleep. "By the trees, that figure." She leaned forward, squinting out the window. "I don't see anything, honey." I pointed, my hand shaking a bit. "Right there, moving along the tree line. It's huge." The thing kept walking, swinging these unnaturally long arms with each step. The arms hung down almost to its knees. It moved with this odd rolling gait, like its joints worked differently than ours. My wife still couldn't see it, which seems impossible to me now. It was right there. But the thing was, as the creature reached a denser part of the trees, it just disappeared, blended in somehow, despite its size. I grabbed my coat and boots, ignoring my wife asking where I was going. I'm not sure what possessed me. Looking back, it was pretty stupid, but I had to see if there were tracks. I trudged across the yard, the frozen grass crunching under my feet. When I reached the spot where I'd seen it walking, there was nothing. No footprints, no broken branches, no sign anything had passed through. The ground was frozen solid, which might explain the lack of prints, but still, something that Big should have left some trace. I stood there for a long time, scanning the woods, suddenly very aware of how quiet it was. No birds singing, no small animals rustling in the undergrowth, just silence and the feeling of being watched. When I got back to the house, my wife looked concerned. What was that all about? I thought I saw something. Must have been a deer or something, I lied. I didn't want her thinking I was losing it. For weeks afterward, I kept watching the tree line, especially in the mornings. I never saw the creature again, at least not then, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was out there. Life went on. Winter turned to spring, then summer. I almost convinced myself I'd imagined the whole thing, or that it had been some weird trick of the light. We settled into our new home, made friends with neighbors, got to know the area better. Then came October. My younger brother Dave is big into hunting, and he wanted to scout my property as a potential spot for deer season. I'm not much of a hunter myself, but I told him he was welcome to check it out. He arrived on a Saturday morning with all his gear. After lunch, He headed out to walk the property and look for signs of deer trails, bedding areas, that kind of thing. I stayed back at the house to finish some yard work, figuring I'd join him later. Around 4 in the afternoon, the sun was getting lower, and I realized Dave had been out there for a while. I decided to go find him, partly to see what he'd discovered, and partly because I wanted to wrap things up before dark. I grabbed my jacket and a flashlight just in case and headed toward the woods. The day had been mild for November, maybe mid-50s, but there was a chill setting in as evening approached. The leaves had mostly fallen, making the woods more open than they'd been in summer. I followed what I thought would be Dave's path, calling out for him every so often. The woods were quiet except for the occasional rustle of leaves in the breeze. I'd gone maybe a quarter-mile in when I heard it. A sound like somebody throwing huge logs around, not just branches breaking, but the solid thunk of something heavy hitting the ground, then another and another. Like something was tossing around pieces of timber the size of fence posts. "Dave!" I called out, thinking maybe he was clearing some deadfall to make a path. The sounds stopped instantly. The silence that followed was absolute. Not even the wind seemed to move. "Dave, is that you?" I tried again, my voice sounding too loud in the stillness. Nothing. I took a few cautious steps forward, sweeping my gaze across the trees ahead. That's when I caught movement about 30 yards ahead of me, something large and dark, slipping between 2 thick shrubs. It moved so fast I almost missed it, but what struck me most was how silently it moved. Something that big should have made noise crashing through the underbrush, but there was nothing, just this massive dark shape that was there 1 second and gone the next. My heart was hammering in my chest. I stood frozen, straining to hear or see anything. For a split second, I thought I saw 2 points of reflection, like eyes catching what little light filtered through the trees, but then they were gone. "Dave!" I shouted, no longer caring how loud I was. "Dave, where are you?" "Over here," came his reply from somewhere to my left, away from where I'd seen the movement. His voice sounded normal, casual even, which was somehow more unsettling. I practically ran toward his voice, stumbling over roots and fallen branches. I found him kneeling by a small stream, examining some deer tracks in the mud. "You okay?" he asked, looking up at me with concern. "You sound freaked out." I was breathing hard, still scanning the woods around us. "Did you hear that noise? Like something throwing logs around?" He shook his head. "Nah, been pretty quiet. Saw some good sign, though. Looks like a decent-sized buck's been using this as a water source." I didn't know what to say. Should I tell him what I'd seen? Would he think I was crazy? "It's getting dark," I said finally. "We should head back." As we walked, I kept looking over my shoulder. Dave chatted about hunting plans, completely oblivious to my unease. I kept quiet about what I'd seen, partly because I wasn't sure myself, and partly because I didn't want to sound like I was losing my mind. That night, after Dave had gone to bed in the guest room, I sat up late in the living room with all the lights on. I couldn't stop thinking about what I'd seen, both that day and back in January. There was something out there in my woods, something that didn't make sense. A couple weeks later, we had a local contractor named Jim over to give us an estimate on building a deck. While measuring the back of the house, he mentioned something that made my blood run cold. "Beautiful piece of land you got here," he said, looking toward the woods. "My brother-in-law owns property about 3 miles down the road. Says he saw something weird out in these woods last month." I tried to sound casual. "Weird how?" Jim chuckled. He's probably full of it. Said he saw some massive black hairy creature crawling on all 4s through the brush. Everyone gave him shit about it for weeks." My mouth went dry. What happened? Well, here's the kicker. His wife saw it too about a week later. Said she was washing dishes and looked up to see this thing standing outside their window. Scared the hell out of her. She'd been the one teasing him the most about it, so that shut her up quick. Jim was still smiling, like it was just a funny story, but I couldn't even fake a laugh. I just nodded and mumbled something about wild animals, sometimes looking strange in certain lights. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept getting up to check the windows, making sure they were locked. My wife thought I was being paranoid, but she hadn't seen what I had. I never told anyone the full story until now. I still live in that house, though my wife and I separated 3 years later for unrelated reasons. The woods don't seem as threatening during the day anymore, but I never go out there after dark. Never. Sometimes when I'm having my morning coffee, I still find myself staring at that tree line, waiting. I've installed security cameras, motion sensor lights, the works. They've never captured anything unusual, but I know what I saw. And sometimes, on very quiet nights when the wind is still, I hear those sounds again, heavy things being thrown around in the darkness, and I lie awake, wondering what's out there, watching and waiting. Story 12. I've been debating whether to share this for almost a decade now. Part of me feels like writing it down might help me process it, but I'm also afraid people will just think I'm crazy or making it up for attention. I've only told 3 people about this: my sister, my ex, and my therapist. My therapist suggested I was suffering from heat exhaustion that day, but I know what I saw. It wasn't a hallucination. This happened in the summer of 2014. I was 27 and had just gotten through a pretty messy breakup. I decided to take a solo road trip from Oklahoma City to Nashville to clear my head. My little Italian greyhound, Pixel, came with me. He was always my travel buddy. He's gone now, passed away 3 years ago, but he was only 4 back then and full of energy. I had mapped out this winding route through northern Arkansas because I wanted to avoid the main highways and just enjoy the drive. The back roads there are gorgeous in summer, all these rolling hills with dense forest and barely any traffic. I had this old Subaru Outback that handled the hills perfectly, and I was just taking my time, stopping whenever I felt like it to take pictures or let Pixel stretch his legs. It was around 2 in the afternoon when I pulled over at this random spot. There wasn't an official viewpoint or anything, just a little gravel turnout next to the road with what looked like a well-worn path going up this steep hill. I figured the view from the top would be worth the short hike. It was hot, probably mid-90s, but there was a nice breeze and I had plenty of water. This is where things started getting weird. I grabbed Pixel's leash, opened the car door, and he just wouldn't get out. Normally he'd be bouncing around, eager to explore, but he stayed curled up on the passenger seat. I tried coaxing him with treats, but he just looked at me and then tucked his nose under his paw. It was so out of character for him. I remember feeling this strange prickle on the back of my neck, like maybe I should listen to my dog's instincts. But I brushed it off, thinking he was just tired from the drive. I left him in the car with the windows cracked a few inches, made sure he had water, and headed up the path alone. The hill wasn't super steep, but it was enough to get my heart rate up. The path was surrounded by tall grass at first, then became more wooded as I climbed. It took maybe 15 minutes to reach the top. The view was exactly what I'd hoped for. I could see for miles across the tree-covered hills and the gravel road winding through the valley below. There were no houses, no power lines, nothing man-made visible from where I stood, just wilderness. I remember taking out my phone to snap some pictures, disappointed that Pixel wasn't there to pose in them. The breeze felt good against my sweaty skin, and for a few minutes I just stood there enjoying the solitude. That's when I noticed something off. I can't even explain what drew my attention at first. It was like that feeling when someone's staring at you, and you just know it. I was looking out at the view when I caught movement in my peripheral vision, off to the right. When I turned to look, I froze. About 50 yards away, near where the trees started getting dense, something was moving. At first my brain tried to make sense of it. Was it a bear standing on its hind legs? But no, bears don't stand like that for that long. And this thing was tall, really tall. I'm 5'8", and this thing had to be at least 7 feet. It was covered in thick greyish hair, not fur exactly, more like long matted hair. The colour wasn't uniform. It had darker patches on its back and shoulders. But what really struck me were its proportions. Its arms were unnaturally long, hanging down to its knees, and they looked powerful, like tree trunks covered in hair. I couldn't see its face clearly from that distance, but I remember thinking its head seemed small compared to its massive body. It was just wrong. Not like any animal I'd ever seen or even heard of. For what felt like forever, but was probably only seconds, I stood there, unable to move. The thing hadn't seen me yet. It was moving slowly toward the tree line, walking upright on two legs with this smooth but powerful gait. There was something deliberate about its movements, something intelligent. Then my phone slipped from my hand and clattered on the rocky ground. The sound wasn't particularly loud, but in that moment of silence, it might as well have been a gunshot. The creature stopped. Then it turned, not just its head, but its whole body, and I swear to God it looked right at me. I still couldn't make out its facial features clearly, but I could feel its eyes on me. My stomach dropped like I was on a roller coaster, and every instinct screamed at me to run. But I was frozen in place. For maybe 5 seconds, we just stared at each other across the distance. Then, something hit the ground about 10 feet to my left with a heavy thud. I jumped and looked over. It was a rock, not a small pebble, but a substantial stone, maybe the size of my fist. Before I could process what that meant, another rock landed closer to me, and then another. They were coming from the direction of the creature. It was throwing rocks at me, not randomly but deliberately and with force. One whizzed past my head close enough that I felt the air move. That finally broke my paralysis. I turned and ran down that hill faster than I've ever moved in my life. I wasn't even following the path anymore, just crashing through undergrowth, slipping on loose dirt, barely keeping my balance. Branches whipped across my face and arms, but I didn't slow down. I could hear more thuds behind me, more rocks hitting the ground, and something else that might have been footsteps, heavy and fast. I didn't look back, not once. I was terrified that if I turned my head, I'd see that thing right behind me, those long arms reaching for me. My lungs were burning, and my legs felt like jelly, but pure adrenaline kept me moving. When I finally burst out of the trees near the road, I sprinted the last few yards to my car. Pixel was standing on the passenger seat now, his front paws on the dashboard, watching for me. He was making this high-pitched whining sound I'd never heard before. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely get the key in the ignition. As I fumbled with it, I finally allowed myself a quick glance back up the hill. I didn't see the creature, but I swear I could see the tall grass moving in a path coming down the hill, not from wind, but like something large was pushing through it. The engine started, and I peeled out of that turnout, spraying gravel everywhere. I drove way too fast on those winding roads, checking my rearview mirror constantly. Pixel wouldn't settle down. He kept pacing on the seat and looking out the back window, which only made me more panicked. I didn't stop driving until I reached a gas station about 20 miles away. I sat there in the parking lot, hands still trembling on the steering wheel, trying to make sense of what I'd seen. Part of me wanted to report it to someone, but who? What would I even say? I saw a giant, hairy creature in the woods that threw rocks at me. They'd think I was nuts or on drugs. The logical part of my brain tried to rationalize it. Maybe it was just a very tall person in some kind of ghillie suit, playing a sick prank. But that doesn't explain the proportions, those impossibly long arms, or the way it moved. No human moves like that. And why would someone be out in the middle of nowhere, in that heat, just waiting to scare a random hiker? I ended up driving straight through to Nashville that day, no more scenic stops. For weeks afterward, I had nightmares about those long arms reaching for me. I've done research since then, read about Bigfoot sightings and other cryptids, but nothing quite matches what I saw. The rock-throwing behavior is apparently common in Bigfoot reports, which I didn't know at the time. But the proportions and the grayish hair don't fit typical descriptions. I've never gone back to that area. I don't even like driving through Arkansas anymore. Sometimes I try to convince myself it was just my imagination or a case of mistaken identity, but then I remember Pixel's behavior. He knew something was wrong before I did. Animals sense things we can't. I still can't explain what I encountered that day. All I know is that whatever it was territorial, intelligent enough to use projectile weapons, and absolutely not something science has acknowledged exists. It fundamentally changed how I view the wilderness. There are things out there we don't understand, things that don't want to be found. And sometimes, when I'm alone at night and my mind wanders, I wonder, what if it had caught up to me on that hillside? What would have happened then? To this day, I haven't been able to hike alone. The thought of being isolated in the woods makes my heart race. And I always listen when my pets act strangely now. They know things we don't. Story 13. I've always been a history buff. Ever since I was a kid, I was the weird one who'd rather visit a museum than go to the movies. So when I got the chance to participate in a Civil War reenactment at Hildene Mansion near Manchester, Vermont last fall, I jumped at it. As a historian specializing in the Civil War period, these events are like Christmas to me. But what happened during those 2 nights has made me question everything I know about the world we live in. Hildene is this gorgeous historic estate that used to belong to Abraham Lincoln's son. It sits on this sprawling property with these incredible gardens and rolling hills. Really picturesque New England stuff. But it's also got these dense woods pressing in on 2 sides of the main grounds. During the day, those woods just look like a nice backdrop. At night, they become something else entirely. There were about 20 of us participating in the reenactment. We'd set up period-accurate tents on the grounds, wore authentic uniforms, itchy as hell by the way, and generally tried to recreate what camp life would have been like for soldiers in the 1860s. The estate managers had given us permission to stay overnight on the property to make the experience more immersive. Most of us were seasoned reenactors who'd done this kind of thing dozens of times before. The first day went off without a hitch. We did demonstrations for visitors, talked about the weapons and equipment, and even staged a small skirmish. By nightfall, we were all pretty tired but in good spirits. Some of the guys broke character after the visitors left and pulled out some beers. Definitely not period accurate, but who's counting? We sat around the campfire, swapping stories and just enjoying being out under the stars. Around midnight, most of the group had turned in. I stayed up a bit longer, jotting down some notes for a paper I was working on about Civil War camp logistics. By 1 in the morning, I finally crawled into my tent and fell asleep almost instantly. I woke up sometime between 1 and 2, needing to use the bathroom. The estate had set up porta potties for us about 100 yards from our camp, across this gravel path that cut through a small field. I grabbed my flashlight, slipped on my boots, and stepped out into the night. It was one of those perfectly clear Vermont autumn nights. Crisp air, millions of stars overhead, and a half moon providing just enough light to see the main shapes around me. The temperature had dropped considerably, and I could see my breath clouding in front of my face. Everyone else was asleep. The only sounds were the gentle rustling of canvas tents in the slight breeze, and some distant owl hoots. The path to the bathrooms was lined with these old-fashioned wool drapes hung between poles, part of the daytime exhibit explaining how laundry was done during the Civil War. In the dark, they created this tunnel-like effect that was a bit disorienting. My flashlight beam bounced off them, creating weird shadows as I walked. I was about halfway to the bathrooms when I first heard it, footsteps coming from the woods to my left. At first, I thought nothing of it. Probably just another reenactor heading to the bathroom, right? But then I realized something odd. The footsteps were perfectly in sync with mine. When I walked, they walked. When I paused, they paused. I stopped dead in my tracks, and for about 3 seconds there was complete silence. Then, Just as I was about to convince myself I'd imagined it, I heard a single, heavy footstep from within the tree line, like whatever was there had shifted its weight. "Hello?" I called out, swinging my flashlight toward the woods. "Anyone there?" No response, just the rustling of leaves in the breeze. I told myself it was probably just one of the guys messing with me. Some of the reenactors can be real pranksters, or maybe it was an animal, a deer or something. But deep down, I knew it wasn't either of those things. There was something deliberate about those footsteps, something intelligent. I started walking again, faster this time, and immediately the footsteps resumed, matching my pace exactly. They were heavy, much heavier than a human footfall should be. Each step had this weighty thud that seemed to reverberate through the ground. And they were keeping perfect time with mine, like whatever was making them was intentionally synchronizing with my movements. The bathroom was still about 50 yards away, across this shadowy stretch of open ground. The footsteps continued alongside me, always staying just within the tree line, never venturing into the open where I might see them. I'm not ashamed to admit I started running, and the footsteps ran too, these massive thundering impacts that no human could make. The sound followed me all the way to the bathroom, where I practically threw myself inside and slammed the door shut. I stood there in that tiny porta potty, breathing hard, listening. For a few minutes, there was nothing. Then, right outside, something moved past the door. I could hear the gravel crunching under its weight, and for a brief moment, the plastic walls of the bathroom seemed to darken slightly, as if something large was blocking the moonlight. I waited in there for what felt like an eternity, though my watch told me it was only about 15 minutes. Eventually, I gathered my courage, opened the door a crack, and peered out. Nothing. Just the empty path back to camp. I made it back to my tent without incident, though I felt eyes on me the entire way. I didn't sleep much after that. The next morning, I debated whether to mention it to the others. In the daylight, the whole thing seemed silly. I'd probably just freaked myself out and mistaken normal forest sounds for something sinister. Besides, I didn't want to be that guy who gets spooked by shadows and winds up the butt of jokes for the rest of the weekend. So I kept quiet. The second day of the reenactment went smoothly. More demonstrations, another mock battle, and interactions with visitors. I found myself constantly glancing at the woods, though, half expecting to see something watching us. But in the daylight, they were just trees, old, gnarled New England maples and oaks starting to turn their autumn colors. That evening, we had a bigger campfire going. The temperature had dropped even further, and we were all huddled close to the flames. There were about 10 of us still awake around 11, sharing ghost stories appropriately enough. Dave, one of the older guys who'd been doing reenactments for decades, was in the middle of telling us about a supposedly haunted battlefield in Pennsylvania when we all heard it. Footsteps, coming from the same stretch of woods as the night before. Heavy, deliberate steps moving parallel to our camp, just within the tree line. Everyone fell silent. Dave stopped mid-sentence, and we all turned toward the sound. "Someone still out there?" asked Mike, one of the guys portraying a Confederate sergeant. No one answered. We all knew everyone in our group was accounted for. The footsteps continued, moving slowly along the perimeter of the woods. They had that same unnatural heaviness I'd heard the night before, like something massive walking on two legs. "Hey!" shouted Dave, standing up and pointing his flashlight toward the sound. "Who's there?" The moment his light hit the trees, the footsteps stopped. Complete silence fell over everything, not even the normal nighttime forest sounds of insects or animals. It was as if the entire woods were holding its breath. Dave kept his light trained on the spot for about 30 seconds, then clicked it off with a nervous laugh. "Probably just a deer," he said, sitting back down. The instant, and I mean the very instant, his flashlight went off, the footsteps resumed. Only now they were closer to the edge of the trees, almost at the point where the forest meets the lawn. 5 or 6 of us immediately pulled out our flashlights and aimed them at the sound. Again, as soon as light flooded the area, the footsteps stopped. We swept our beams through the trees, illuminating trunks and underbrush, but saw nothing unusual. "This is weird," muttered Mike, not taking his eyes off the woods. We kept our lights on for several minutes, creating this wall of illumination between our camp and the tree line. Nothing moved, no sound. Then, by some unspoken agreement, we all turned our flashlights off at roughly the same time. The footsteps immediately started again, but now they were behind us, coming from a completely different section of forest on the opposite side of our camp. I felt the hair on my neck stand up. Whatever this was, it had circled around our entire camp in complete silence, impossibly fast, while we were looking the other way. "Okay, this isn't funny," called out Rachel, one of the few women in our group. "Whoever's doing this, knock it off!" The footsteps stopped momentarily, as if considering her words. Then they resumed, but now they were moving in this bizarre pattern, stopping, starting, changing direction, sometimes seeming to come from multiple places at once. It was like whatever was making them wanted us to know that it wasn't human, that it didn't move like we do. We tried the flashlight trick again. Same result. Immediate silence when illuminated, resumption of sound the moment darkness returned. But now it was playing with us. The footsteps would start in one spot, we'd shine lights there, they'd stop, and then the instant we lowered our lights, they'd begin from somewhere completely different. This went on for almost an hour. Some of the group tried to laugh it off, suggesting it was estate security messing with us, or maybe local kids. But I could see it in their eyes. They were scared. We all were, because we all recognized that these movements weren't following any established trail. They were coming from places in the woods where no human could easily walk, especially in the dark. And there were never any accompanying sounds, no voices, no rustling of clothes, no snapping of twigs, just those heavy, deliberate footsteps. Around midnight, things escalated. The footsteps suddenly rushed toward our camp, not from one direction, but from multiple points around the perimeter of the woods. Heavy, fast impacts on the ground that actually made the dirt around our fire pit vibrate slightly. Several people jumped up, swearing. I remember Rachel screamed. We all switched our flashlights on, pointing them in wild arcs around us. Silence fell instantly. Complete and absolute stillness. We stood there in a circle, backs to each other, lights pointed outward like some kind of pathetic defense system. No one spoke. We just listened, straining to hear anything over the pounding of our own hearts. After about 5 minutes of this standoff, Dave broke the silence. "I think it's gone," he said, his voice uncharacteristically shaky. But it wasn't gone, because the moment he said those words, from directly overhead came the sound of something massive shifting its weight in the branches of the huge oak tree right next to our campfire. A shower of leaves and small twigs rained down on us. We all looked up, flashlights pointed skyward, illuminating the branches. There was nothing there. Nothing that we could see, anyway. But something had been there seconds before, something heavy enough to shake a massive oak limb. That was when the group consensus shattered. Half the reenactors insisted on breaking character completely and sleeping in their cars. The rest, including me, retreated to our tents, though I doubt any of us actually slept. I lay awake all night, listening to those footsteps circling our camp, sometimes coming right up to the wall of my tent, so close I could feel the ground depress slightly with each impact. By morning, they were gone. We packed up in record time, barely speaking to each other. No one wanted to acknowledge what had happened, but no one could forget it either. I've participated in dozens of reenactments since then, but I've never gone back to Hildene, and I always make sure my tent is pitched in open ground, far from any trees, because sometimes, when I'm just drifting off to sleep, I still hear those footsteps, matching mine, step for step, waiting just beyond the light. Story 14. I've been debating whether to share this for years. I'm not looking for attention or trying to convince anyone of anything. I just need to put this somewhere because it's been eating at me since it happened. And maybe someone else has experienced something similar. I've been hunting in Vermont my entire life. My dad took me out for my first hunt when I was 12, and I've spent more days in those woods than I can count. Washington County has been my stomping ground for nearly 3 decades. I know every ridge, valley, and game trail in the northeast section like the back of my hand. In November of 2015, I was out for the bow season like usual. I had a spot about 4 miles from any main road, deep enough that most hunters don't bother with it. It's a small clearing on the side of a ridge with good sight lines down into a valley where deer often travel in the early morning. I'd had success there in previous seasons. That Tuesday morning was cold, but not bitter, maybe 35 degrees. The moon was just a sliver, making the pre-dawn darkness nearly complete. I parked my truck at my usual access point around 5, strapped on my headlamp, and started the hour-long hike to my spot. The woods were quiet that morning, not even the usual rustling of nocturnal animals heading to bed. Just my boots crunching through the fallen leaves and the occasional snap of a twig under my feet. I reached my spot around 5:45, still a good 40 minutes before legal shooting light. I settled in at the base of a large maple, set up my small pack as a cushion, and switched off my headlamp to let my eyes adjust to the darkness. This is something I'd done hundreds of times before, sitting in the pitch black, listening to the forest wake up as the first hints of dawn approach. But something felt off that morning. The silence was too complete. Usually, there's at least some ambient noise, a distant owl, mice scurrying through the underbrush, something. But there was nothing. Just dead silence, the kind that makes your ears strain for any sound at all. I'd been sitting there for maybe 15 minutes when it happened. First came a loud crack from somewhere in the valley below me. Not like a twig snapping under a deer's hoof, but like the sound of a substantial tree trunk being snapped in half. It echoed through the valley, and I immediately sat up straighter, every sense suddenly on high alert. Before the echo of that crack had even fully died out, I heard it, a deliberate knocking sound. Knock, knock, knock. 3 distinct impacts, like someone striking a hollow log with a heavy stick, methodical, purposeful. Each knock was spaced about 2 seconds apart, and they came from roughly the same direction as the tree snap, maybe 500 yards down the valley. My mind was racing. In all my years, I'd never heard anything like this. I was running through possibilities, maybe another hunter setting up, but who would be breaking trees and making all that noise during prime hunting time? It made no sense. And then the scream came. I've heard mountain lions, I've heard the howls of coyote packs, I've heard bears in distress and the weird sounds foxes make that sound almost human. This wasn't any of those. This scream started low and rose in pitch, lasting for what felt like 10 seconds, but was probably closer to 5. It had an intelligence to it, a deliberate quality that made my skin crawl. It wasn't just an animal call. It felt like it was meant to be heard, meant to send a message. The sound bounced off the ridges, making it hard to pinpoint the exact location, but it seemed to come from the same area as the tree snap and knocking. The scream had this unnatural quality that's hard to describe, like it was almost human, but stretched and distorted beyond what human vocal cords should be capable of. When it finally stopped, the silence that followed was suffocating. I realized I was holding my breath, my knuckles white around my bow. My heart was pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. Every instinct told me to get the hell out of there, but I was frozen in place. I didn't want to move and draw attention to myself. As the first faint light of dawn started to filter through the trees, I kept scanning the valley below, straining to see anything moving. But there was nothing. No deer, no other wildlife, nothing. It was like everything had cleared out of the area. I stayed until full daylight, my muscles cramped from being tensed for so long. Part of me wanted to go down into the valley to investigate, to see if I could find a broken tree or any evidence of what made those sounds. But a deeper, more primal part of me knew better. Whatever made those sounds, I didn't want to meet it alone in the woods. I packed up around 9 and hiked back to my truck, constantly looking over my shoulder. I told myself I was being ridiculous. It was probably just some natural phenomenon I hadn't encountered before. Maybe some combination of animals or the wind playing tricks in the valley. I spent that evening researching online, looking up strange animal sounds in Vermont. I found nothing that matched what I'd heard. I almost called the local game warden, but stopped myself. What would I even say? That I heard scary noises in the woods? They'd think I was crazy or had panicked over nothing. I convinced myself it was a one-off thing. Maybe some kind of territorial display between animals I couldn't see. So the next morning I went back. Same spot, same time. I know that sounds insane given how freaked out I was, but I've never been one to scare easily, and I had my sidearm with me this time, something I don't usually carry when bow hunting. The conditions were identical: cold, dark, silent. I set up in the same spot under the same maple tree. As the time approached 6 a.m., I found myself holding my breath, both hoping and fearing I'd hear those sounds again. And then it happened, exactly the same sequence. Crack! A tree or large branch snapping with enough force to echo through the valley. Then the knocking, 3 distinct knocks, methodically spaced. And finally, that scream, starting low and rising to a pitch that made me break out in a cold sweat despite the November chill. The identical nature of the sequence shook me to my core. This wasn't random animal behavior, it was too precise, too deliberate. The exact same pattern at the exact same time on consecutive days. Whatever was making these sounds was following a pattern. It was intelligent. After the scream faded, I heard something new. The sound of movement in the underbrush, far down in the valley but moving in my general direction. Not the careful steps of a deer, but something bigger, something that wasn't trying to move quietly. I didn't wait around. I grabbed my pack and bow and got out of there as quickly and quietly as I could. I didn't run. Running in the woods is a good way to get injured, but I moved with purpose, constantly checking behind me. The feeling of being watched was overwhelming. The hair on the back of my neck stood up the entire hike back to my truck. When I reached my vehicle, I sat there for a long time, hands shaking on the steering wheel. I kept replaying those sounds in my head. The methodical nature of them, the precision, the timing. It wasn't natural. I haven't been back to that spot since. I've hunted other areas of Washington County, but never alone, and never in that particular valley. I've tried to rationalize what I heard. Maybe it was some kind of territorial display from an animal I couldn't identify. Maybe it was other hunters playing some kind of sick prank, though I find that hard to believe given how remote the location was. I've spent my life in these woods. I know the difference between a bear and a moose. I know what a catamount sounds like. I know the calls of every bird native to Vermont. But in all my years, I've never heard anything like what I encountered those 2 November mornings. The thing that still haunts me most is the deliberate nature of the sounds, the precise sequence, the exact timing. Whatever was making those sounds wasn't just communicating. It was following a pattern. It was intelligent, and somehow I feel like it knew I was there, listening. I still hunt. I still spend time in the woods. But something changed for me after those 2 mornings. There's a wariness now that wasn't there before, a feeling that perhaps we don't know these forests as well as we think we do, that maybe there are things out there we haven't properly documented or understood. I don't know what I encountered in Washington County that November. I don't have a name for it or an explanation. All I know is that it was real, it was deliberate, and thinking about that scream still makes my blood run cold, even years later. Sometimes when I'm alone in the quiet, I can still hear it echoing in my head, and I wonder what would have happened if I'd stayed just a little longer. or if I'd gone down into that valley to investigate. Some things, I've decided, are better left unknown. Story 15. I still struggle to explain what happened that morning. It's been 3 months, but I replay those few seconds in my head constantly. My husband Michael and I have lived in Vermont for almost 7 years now, so we're used to seeing wildlife. Bears, moose, deer, you name it. But what we saw on Route 9 wasn't anything natural. I'm certain of that. It was a Tuesday in early October. Michael had a job site in Bennington, and I decided to ride along since I needed to pick up some specialty fabric from a shop there for a project I was working on. We left our house at around 5 in the morning. It was that perfect Vermont fall weather, crisp and chilly enough that you could see your breath, but not bitter cold yet. We'd been on the road for maybe 20 minutes, just past West Brattleboro, heading west on Route 9. The sun wasn't up yet, so our headlights were cutting through that deep, early morning darkness. Michael was driving while I was half dozing in the passenger seat, cradling a travel mug of coffee that was still too hot to drink. The road was completely empty, not surprising for that time of morning in such a rural area. We hadn't passed another car in at least 10 minutes. The radio was playing quietly, some morning talk show that neither of us was really listening to. Michael and I weren't talking much either. We're comfortable with silence after 15 years of marriage. I remember glancing at the dashboard clock. It was 5:32 exactly when movement caught my eye ahead of us. At first I thought it was a deer about to cross the road, which is common enough around here. I sat up straighter, suddenly alert. "Watch out," I said automatically, the way you do when you spot an animal near the road. Michael slowed down slightly, his hands tightening on the wheel. But as our headlights fully illuminated what was crossing the road, I felt my entire body go cold. It wasn't a deer. It wasn't anything I recognized. The thing was small, maybe 3 or 4 feet tall at most. It was standing and running on 2 legs, completely upright like a person. But it didn't move like a person. The speed was wrong. Completely wrong. It was moving so fast that it seemed to almost glide across the pavement, its legs blurring with the unnatural quickness of its movements. Our headlights caught it fully for maybe 2 seconds, and I could see it was covered in dark hair. Not fur exactly, but long, shaggy hair that looked almost black, or a very dark brown. It didn't turn to look at us. It just kept moving in that fluid, impossibly fast motion. In the span of what felt like a heartbeat, it had crossed the entire width of the road and disappeared into the brush on the other side, near an old stone wall that lined that stretch of Route 9. And then it was gone. No rustling vegetation, no sound at all, just gone. Michael and I didn't speak for what felt like forever. The car had slowed to maybe 30 miles per hour, but he didn't stop. I think we were both too shocked to even suggest it. Finally, I managed to say, "Did you see that?" Michael nodded, his face pale in the glow of the dashboard lights. "What the hell was that?" "I don't know," I whispered. My coffee had sloshed onto my jeans when I jolted upright, but I couldn't even feel the heat. It wasn't a deer. "No," Michael agreed. "It was on 2 legs." "Could it have been a kid?" I asked, even though I knew it wasn't. No child moves like that. Nothing human moves like that. Michael shook his head. "No way. Did you see how fast it was moving? And it was covered in, I don't know, hair or something." We drove in silence for another mile or so, both of us processing. I kept replaying the image in my mind, that small, dark figure moving with impossible speed and grace across the asphalt. "Should we turn around?" I finally asked. "Go back and look?" Michael hesitated, then checked his watch. "I don't know, Sarah. What would we even be looking for? It's gone now." Part of me was relieved he didn't want to go back. Another part of me wishes desperately that we had. Maybe we would have found tracks, or hair, or something to explain what we'd seen. But we kept driving. We talked about it the whole way to Bennington. We considered every possible animal it could have been. A bear cub, but they don't run on two legs for that distance. A large raccoon, but the proportions were all wrong. Even a monkey that might have escaped from somewhere. But where? In rural Vermont. Nothing fit. Nothing explained what we'd seen. By the time we reached Bennington an hour later, we'd almost convinced ourselves it must have been some kind of optical illusion. A deer moving in a strange way that just looked bipedal in the headlights. But we both knew that wasn't true. We'd both seen it clearly, if only for a few seconds. Michael spent the day at his construction site, and I browsed shops in town after getting my fabric. But I couldn't focus on anything. My mind kept going back to that thing on Route 9. On the drive home that evening, we were both tense as we approached the area where we'd seen it. It was still light out, around 5 in the afternoon, but I found myself scanning the roadside obsessively. Michael was doing the same thing, driving slower than necessary. We didn't see anything unusual on the return journey. Just the normal Vermont landscape. Trees beginning to turn brilliant shades of orange and red, occasional farmhouses set back from the road, stone walls running alongside fields. When we passed the exact spot, I noted it carefully. It was a fairly nondescript stretch of road, with thick woods on one side and a more open, brushy area with that old stone wall on the other. Nothing special about it, nothing that would explain what we'd seen. That night I couldn't sleep. I kept seeing that small, dark figure racing across the road with that unnatural speed. I'd convinced myself that we needed to go back and investigate properly. The next morning, I woke Michael up early. "I want to go back to that spot," I told him, "in daylight, just to look around." He seemed relieved that I'd suggested it, like he'd been thinking the same thing. After a quick breakfast, we drove back out to Route 9. It took us a while to find the exact location. Everything looks different in daylight and without the pressure of the moment, but eventually we recognized the stone wall and pulled over onto the narrow shoulder. The morning was bright and clear, totally different from the previous day's pre-dawn darkness. Birds were singing and occasional cars passed us, drivers giving curious glances at us standing by the roadside. We crossed to where we'd seen the creature disappear. The brush was thick there, a tangle of native shrubs and saplings growing up against the old stone wall. We pushed our way in, looking for, well, I don't know what we were looking for. Footprints? Hair caught on branches? Some sign that what we'd seen was real? We spent nearly an hour searching the area, working our way along the stone wall in both directions from where we thought the creature had crossed. We found nothing unusual. No tracks that couldn't be explained by normal wildlife, no strange hair, no evidence at all that anything out of the ordinary had passed through. "Maybe it was further down," Michael suggested, but his voice lacked conviction. We both knew we were in the right spot. After we gave up the search, we sat in the car for a while, trying to make sense of what had happened. "We both saw it," I said firmly. "It wasn't our imagination." "I know," Michael agreed, "but what was it? That's the question that still haunts me 3 months later. What did we see on Route 9 that morning? I've spent countless hours researching online. At first, I looked into known wildlife in Vermont. Nothing matches what we saw. Then I expanded to cryptids and folklore. The closest thing I could find were stories of little people from Native American traditions, or perhaps accounts of what some call dogmen, though the size doesn't match those descriptions. I even reached out to a local wildlife expert, carefully describing what we'd seen without revealing how bizarre the movement had been. He suggested it might have been a fisher cat, but when I looked those up, they don't match at all. I've driven past that spot dozens of times since then, at different times of day and night. I've never seen anything unusual again. Sometimes I pull over and just sit there, watching the woods and the old stone wall, hoping for another glimpse, and also terrified of actually getting one. Michael doesn't like talking about it anymore. About a month after it happened, he started dismissing it as probably just a weird-looking coyote when I brought it up. But I can tell he doesn't believe that. Sometimes I catch him staring out the window at night like he's looking for something in the darkness. The thing that bothers me most is the speed. Nothing moves that fast, not naturally anyway. It was almost like the creature was gliding or floating across the pavement, its legs moving in a blur. And the silence. Even thinking about it now makes my skin crawl. Something crossing a road that quickly should make noise, feet hitting asphalt, brush rustling when it disappeared into the vegetation. But there was nothing. Absolute silence. I've considered setting up trail cameras in the area, but it feels like crossing a line somehow. Like I'd be invading something's territory, and honestly, I'm not sure I want proof. What if I caught it on camera and it was even stranger than I remember? What if seeing it clearly, without the disorientation of that early morning encounter, would make it impossible for me to explain away? What I do know is that Route 9 doesn't feel the same to me anymore. That stretch of road past West Brattleboro used to be just another part of my regular drive. Now it feels charged somehow, like the boundary between the world I understand and something else entirely. I wonder if anyone else has seen it. I've checked local Facebook groups and community forums, even the weird corners of Reddit, where people share strange encounters, but found nothing that matches our experience. Either we're the only ones who've seen this thing, or others have seen it and, like us, struggle to find the words to describe what they witnessed. Sometimes I think about what would have happened if we'd stopped immediately. If we'd pulled over and gotten out of the car while whatever it was might still have been nearby. Would we have found evidence? Would we have seen it again? Or would something worse have happened? I don't know, and that not knowing eats at me. Those few seconds on Route 9 at 5:32 in the morning have changed how I see the world. I used to think I understood the natural order of things, the kinds of creatures that exist in our Vermont forests. Now I'm not so sure. I keep replaying those seconds in my mind. The small, hair-covered figure running with that impossible speed across the pavement in the glare of our headlights. It was so brief, less than 10 seconds from first sighting to disappearance. But it was enough to make me question everything I thought I knew. Whatever it was, it doesn't belong in any wildlife guide or nature documentary. And 3 months later, I'm no closer to understanding what my husband and I saw on Route 9 that chilly October morning. Story 16. I've debated sharing this for years. Part of me wants to forget it ever happened, but another part needs to get this off my chest. I've been backpacking and hiking since I was 12, and by 34, I'd logged thousands of wilderness miles across the Pacific Northwest. What happened to me in the North Cascades in early August of 2001 changed everything I thought I knew about the wilderness. I'd taken a week off work to do some solo backpacking in the more remote areas of North Cascades National Park. I specifically chose the Cascade River area because it was less traveled, and I wanted some genuine solitude. I'd been planning this trip for months, carefully mapping my route and packing light but thoroughly. I'm not some weekend warrior who heads out unprepared. I've done winter camping in the Olympics, multi-week treks through the Wallowas, and guided backcountry trips professionally for 3 seasons. I know the woods, their sounds, and their wildlife. My first 2 days on the trail were exactly what I'd hoped for. Perfect August weather, not another soul for miles, and that incredible sensation of being completely immersed in nature. On my 3rd night out, I set up camp in a small clearing about 20 miles from the nearest trailhead. As always, I hung my food bag about 80 yards from my tent, suspending it between 2 trees well above ground level. Standard practice to avoid bear encounters. I fell asleep around 10 that night, comfortable in my 1-person North Face tent that had sheltered me through countless backcountry trips. The first thing I remember was waking suddenly to a noise. My watch read 3:23 in the morning. It was that deep, pre-dawn darkness where you can barely see your hand in front of your face. Something was tampering with my bear bag. This wasn't unusual in itself. I'd dealt with bears, raccoons, and other critters attempting to raid my supplies before, but the quality of the sound was different. There was a deliberateness to it that set off immediate alarm bells. I lay perfectly still, listening intently. Whatever was out there seemed heavy. I could hear branches straining under weight that exceeded that of a typical black bear. The movement patterns didn't match any animal I was familiar with either. After about 10 minutes, the noise at my bear bag stopped. That's when the footsteps began, heavy, deliberate steps, moving directly toward my tent. I'm not ashamed to admit my heart was pounding against my ribs so hard I thought it might bruise. The footsteps stopped just outside my tent, and for a moment there was complete silence. Then came a sound I'll never forget. A deep, ragged breathing. Not the panting of a bear or the snuffling of an elk. This was the only way I can describe it is human-like, but distorted and rough, like someone with severe respiratory problems trying to breathe quietly. Then it began circling my tent, slowly, methodically. On its first circuit, I felt something drag across the rainfly of my tent, not claws or paws, but what distinctly felt like fingers, long fingers, pulling across the nylon with deliberate pressure, just enough to make the fabric bend inward without tearing it. I remained frozen, clutching my hunting knife, though I knew it would be useless against anything large enough to make those sounds. The breathing never stopped as it completed 3 full circles around my tent. Each time it passed the door, the breathing would intensify, as if it was leaning closer, perhaps trying to catch my scent. What struck me most was how it moved. Despite its obvious weight, it moved bipedally, on 2 legs. Not the 4-legged gait of a bear or cougar, 2 legs, like a human, but not. After the 3rd circle, it just left. I heard those heavy footsteps recede into the forest. I didn't sleep another minute that night. I just lay there, knife in hand, ears straining for any sound of its return. When the first hint of daylight filtered through my tent, I cautiously unzipped the door and peered out. The forest looked normal. Birds were starting their morning songs. But I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. I quickly packed up my essentials and went to check my bear bag. It had been tampered with, no doubt about it. The rope had been pulled and stretched. The bag itself showed strange marks. Not tears from claws, but indentations where something had squeezed it, trying to determine its contents, perhaps. Some of my food was missing, though the bag was still securely tied. What really got to me was the path from my bear bag to my tent. The grass was clearly pressed down in a line that circled my tent exactly 3 times, just as I'd heard during the night. But here's the thing that made my skin crawl. The path crossed a section of muddy trail, yet there were no footprints. None. The grass was flattened, but the mud showed absolutely nothing. I checked the weather on my portable radio and learned storms were moving in. I needed to make a decision fast. There was a Forest Service cabin another 5 miles deeper into the valley that I knew about from previous trips. It wasn't on my original itinerary, but I decided heading there for shelter was my best option. I couldn't face another night in the open, not after what had happened. I hiked hard that day, constantly looking over my shoulder, stopping frequently to listen. The forest felt different now, threatening rather than welcoming. I reached the area where the cabin was supposed to be around 4 in the afternoon. My spirits sank when I found it locked and securely shuttered. I hadn't really expected it to be open, but I'd hoped. With daylight fading and the storm clouds gathering, I had to set up camp again. I chose a spot near the cabin, backing my tent against a steep drop-off so nothing could approach from behind. Then I did something I'd never done before. I built not 1, but 3 separate fires in a semicircle around my tent, creating a barrier of light and warmth. As darkness fell, the feeling of being watched intensified. The hairs on my neck stood up constantly. The fires cast long shadows into the surrounding forest, and sometimes I could swear those shadows moved independently of the flames. Around 9 that night, the stalking began in earnest. I can only describe it as a coordinated effort. I'd hear a twig snap to my left, but when I'd turn to look, I'd catch movement from the corner of my eye on my right. This continued for hours. It was as if whatever was out there was testing my reactions, learning my patterns. I started talking out loud, calmly but firmly stating, "I know you're there. I'm just passing through. I mean no harm." It felt ridiculous, speaking to the darkness, but some instinct told me establishing my presence as intelligent and aware might be important. The response was immediate. The random noises stopped. Complete silence fell over the forest. No insects, no nightbirds, nothing. Just the crackling of my fires and my own ragged breathing. That's when I made the mistake of glancing back over my shoulder toward the large cedar about 15 to 20 yards behind my right side. I saw it. Partially hidden behind the massive trunk, but clearly visible in the firelight, was a figure. A massive, hairy figure, leaning out just enough for me to see its head, shoulder, one arm, and part of its hip. The proportions were all wrong for a human, too large, too broad. The arm looked too long, the head sat directly on the shoulders with almost no neck visible. Our eyes met. I couldn't make out details of its face in the shadows, but I could feel its gaze locked with mine. In that moment, I understood with absolute clarity that I was not the apex predator here, not even close. I didn't run. Something told me running would be the worst possible response. Instead, I slowly turned back to my fire, added more wood, and continued talking in that same calm voice, though inside I was completely terrified. "I'll be gone in the morning," I said, "just passing through." I maintained my fires all night. I didn't sleep, not for a second. Occasionally I would see movement at the edge of the firelight, but never again as clear as that first sighting. The breathing returned throughout the night, that same ragged, labored sound from different positions around my camp. As the first light of dawn broke through the trees, the presence withdrew. I felt its departure as tangibly as I had felt its arrival. Without wasting a minute, I packed up and hiked out at a pace that was probably dangerous given the rough terrain. I covered 15 miles that day, not stopping until I reached an area where I encountered other hikers. I've tried to rationalize what happened. I've read every book on North American wildlife I could find. I've spoken to rangers and naturalists. Nothing explains what I experienced. I still hike and camp, but never alone anymore, never in remote areas, and I never, ever go back to the North Cascades. Some places in the wilderness don't belong to us, and something in that forest made it very clear that I was an unwelcome visitor in its territory. To this day, I can't explain what stalked me for those 2 nights. All I know is that it was intelligent, it was powerful, and it could have taken me any time it wanted. Why it didn't, I'll never know.